It began with noise, a deep, vibrating, bone-shaking noise that rolled across fields and forests long before any soldier saw what made it. American armored warfare on the Western Front didn't arrive quietly or gracefully. It came as a rumble in the earth itself, a warning carried through soil and steel. Before tanks were visible, before their silhouettes cut against the horizon, the ground trembled beneath them like the heartbeat of a giant waking from a long sleep. The first time many infantrymen heard American armor move toward the front, they didn't know what to expect. The sound didn't feel mechanical, it felt alive. Engines growled like something half animal, half machine, pushing forward through mud, rain, frost, and fire. Treads crushed branches, stones, fences, walls. Exhaust fumes mixed with the scent of burnt rubber and cold morning air. Tanks didn't just advance, they rewrote the shape of the land with every mile they gained. But armored warfare was never simple. Inside each steel beast, sweat pooled in the heat, breath grew thin, and the clang of spent shells ricocheted through cramped metal rooms. Crews learned each other's voices not by words, but by tone, a warning, a fear, a question, a command. They fought in darkness, lit only by tracer rounds. They slept curled beneath engines because the warmth was worth the danger. They ate when they could, repaired what broke, and prayed that when the next round came in, the armor would hold. American tanks crossed into Europe with confidence. But that confidence met hard realities. The German armor they faced was heavier. The terrain was worse. The weather tried to break them. The roads turned to rivers of mud. The enemy waited behind hedgerows, in forests, on ridgelines everywhere. The land offered shelter for a gun barrel. Yet American armor adapted. They learned to use speed instead of weight. They learned to flank instead of duel. They learned that a tank wasn't a fortress, it was a promise to the infantry that someone had their back when the world erupted in fire. Through Normandy's suffocating hedgerows, tanks clawed forward foot by foot. Through France's open fields, they surged like waves that refused to break. Through the Ardennes winter, they cracked ice beneath their treads, engines struggling, commanders scraping frost from periscopes. Through Germany's towns and cities, they turned corners with guns ready, always expecting the next shot to come from a window, a cellar, a rooftop, a shadow. American armored warfare on the Western Front was not elegant. It was relentless, heavy, dirty, chaotic, necessary. And behind every advance, every liberated town, every broken line, every mile won, stood the crews who lived in those machines, as if they were extensions of their own bodies. Tonight, we return to that world, to the engine growls before dawn, to the steel echoes inside turrets, to the mud that swallowed boots and coated treads, to the crews who fought battles the world rarely saw, sealed behind armor that offered both protection and imprisonment. Before we continue, I want to ask you something personal in your own words, not about war, but about now. As you listen tonight, what does the quiet around you feel like? Is it soft, dim, gentle, still? Describe the feeling of the space you're in. And something deeper, something emotional, unique to this episode. Tank crews trusted each other completely because they had no other choice. In your own life, is there someone you trust in that quiet, steady way? Someone whose presence calms you, even if the world feels loud? You can share their name if it feels right. And if these long, soft journeys into the past help you ease your thoughts, settle your breathing, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. September 14th, 1944. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western fortress. Lieutenant James Benson pressed his face against the cold earth, listening to the scream of German 88mm shells tearing through the morning fog. 300 yards ahead, dragon's teeth pyramid-shaped concrete obstacles rose from the ground like broken tombstones. Beyond them, pillboxes bristled with machine guns that had already cut down 2 platoons of the 1st Infantry Division. Benson's orders were simple: hold this position until the tanks arrived. The problem was simple too. The tanks weren't coming. Somewhere 3 miles back, the entire complement of Sherman tanks supporting this assault sat hub-deep in Belgian mud, their crews frantically laying timber mats, while German artillery found their range. This was supposed to be the punch that broke Hitler's fortress. Instead, it was becoming another bloodbath, and Benson knew that somewhere in the chain of command, someone had catastrophically miscalculated what American armor could actually do. The irony would have been laughable if men weren't dying. America the industrial colossus that had built more automobiles than any nation in history, had entered the greatest mechanized war ever fought, with an armored force that ranked 17th in the world. In 1939, while Nazi Germany rolled 3,500 tanks across Poland, the United States possessed exactly 329 tanks total. Most were relics from the First World War or experimental models that broke down more often than they ran. The M2A4 light tank, America's frontline armor in 1941, featured riveted construction that turned its own fasteners into deadly shrapnel when struck, a 37mm gun that couldn't penetrate modern enemy armor, and armor plating so thin that heavy machine gun rounds could pierce it at close range. In military exercises before Pearl Harbor, umpires routinely declared these machines destroyed by theoretical enemy forces equipped with weapons America hadn't even begun to manufacture. The tank corps that had helped win World War I under Colonel George S. Patton had been systematically dismantled in the peace that followed, its vehicles sold for scrap, its doctrine forgotten, its very existence nearly erased from army planning. The reasons for this catastrophic unpreparedness ran deeper than simple peacetime neglect. The National Defense Act of 1920 had made a decision that would haunt American soldiers for 2 decades. Tanks were assigned exclusively to the infantry branch, classified as mobile pillboxes, meant to crawl alongside foot soldiers rather than as independent striking forces. This wasn't an oversight but a deliberate choice, rooted in World War I experience where tanks had indeed served primarily as infantry support. While Germany secretly developed panzer divisions in violation of the Versailles Treaty, training crews in combined arms maneuvers that would revolutionize warfare, America's few remaining tanks were scattered across infantry divisions with no unified command, no coherent doctrine, no institutional voice advocating for their development. The cavalry branch, which might have championed mobile warfare, was explicitly forbidden from operating tanks, restricted instead to horses and later to light reconnaissance vehicles, officially classified as combat cars, to circumvent the letter of the law. From 1920 to 1939, the United States spent approximately $1.2 billion on armored vehicle development and production. Germany, in the same period, spent the equivalent of $8 billion. The wake-up call came in May 1940, and it was terrifying. American military observers in France watched the Blitzkrieg unfold with a mixture of disbelief and horror. German panzer divisions, operating as unified formations with integrated air support, artillery, and motorized infantry, carved through French and British forces that, on paper, possessed superior numbers of tanks. The observers sent frantic cables back to Washington describing a new form of warfare that made everything in American doctrine obsolete. Tanks weren't supporting infantry, they were the main effort, punching through defensive lines at speeds that prevented reinforcement, encircling entire armies before those armies even understood they were in danger. One observer noted that a German panzer division could advance further in a day than American infantry could march in a week. The French possessed more tanks than Germany, many of them technically superior machines with thicker armor and better guns. It didn't matter. The French tanks were parceled out to infantry divisions, used defensively, and defeated piecemeal. The lesson was unmistakable. In modern war, the side that could mass armor and move fastest would win, regardless of individual tank quality. Fort Knox, Kentucky, became the unlikely center of America's desperate attempt to catch up. In July 1940, the armored force was officially established, finally giving American tank units independent status and a unified command structure. Major General Admiral Chaffee, a cavalry officer who had studied German tactics obsessively, took command with orders to build an American armored force from almost nothing. The fort that had once guarded the nation's gold reserves now became the training ground for a revolution in American military thinking, but the scale of the challenge was staggering. In 1940, Fort Knox had fewer than 100 tanks available for training. Most instructors had never seen combat. The doctrine manuals being written were theoretical, based on observation and guesswork rather than experience. Chaffee knew they were improvising, hoping that American industrial capacity could somehow compensate for 2 decades of institutional neglect and doctrinal blindness. The tanks America did begin producing in 1940 and 41 reflected this painful learning process. The M3 Lee, rushed into production before Pearl Harbor, was a bizarre machine by any standard, a tall angular vehicle with a 75mm gun mounted in a limited traverse sponson on the right side of the hull and a smaller 37mm gun in a fully rotating turret on top. The design reflected competing requirements and compromises. The infantry wanted a bigger gun for bunker busting, the cavalry wanted a turret for flexibility, and the engineers had to work with existing suspension and transmission components because there wasn't time to design new ones. And the result was a tank that stood nearly 10 feet tall, presenting an enormous target, and required the entire vehicle to rotate to aim its main gun properly. British crews who received the Lee through Lend-Lease called it a mobile coffin and used it only because they had nothing better. American crews training at Fort Knox looked at the Lee's riveted hull and understood what would happen when armor-piercing shells hit those rivets. The fasteners would shear off and ricochet inside the crew compartment like bullets. Still, it was what they had, and in 1941, having any tank was better than having none. George S. Patton, now a general, addressed officer candidates at Fort Knox in December 1941, days after Pearl Harbor transformed preparation into urgent reality. He stood beside an M3 Lee, one hand resting on its angular hull, and made a promise that must have sounded absurd to anyone who understood how far behind America had fallen. "We will beat them at their own game," Patton declared, his voice carrying across the parade ground. "The German thinks he has mastered mechanized warfare. We will prove him wrong." The cadets listening knew that Patton had commanded tanks in World War I, had seen their potential firsthand, and had spent 2 decades watching the army let that potential wither. They also knew that the tank Patton stood beside was inferior to anything Germany fielded. The Panzer III and IV models already rampaging across North Africa and Russia featured better armor, better guns, lower profiles, and crews with years of combat experience. American tankers would be climbing into Lees and the newer M4 Shermans, which existed more as blueprints than actual vehicles, and facing an enemy who had been perfecting armoured warfare, while America debated whether tanks should even exist as independent units. The industrial response was already beginning, even if the Doctrine lagged behind. Henry Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, companies that had built America's automobile supremacy, were converting production lines to military use with shocking speed. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit, purpose-built for tank production, would eventually produce one M4 Sherman every 45 minutes at peak capacity, but production was only part of the equation. These tanks needed crews, and those crews needed training, and that training needed to be based on doctrine that didn't yet exist, because America had never fought a major armoured campaign. Fort Knox was graduating thousands of tankers, but graduating them into what? A theory of warfare that might be completely wrong. The men climbing into American tanks in 1942 were about to become the test cases for whether American armor could be transformed from worst to first, fast enough to matter. Lieutenant Benson, still pinned down outside the Siegfried Line in September 1944, represented the end result of that frantic 4-year transformation. The tanks that weren't reaching him weren't absent because America couldn't build them by late 1944. Sherman production had created a surplus that filled depots across Europe. They weren't stuck in mud because American tankers lacked skill. The crews had been trained to standards that would have seemed impossibly rigorous in 1940. They were stuck because war is chaos, because logistics fail, because even the best plans collapse when real terrain and real weather and real enemy action intervene. But Benson didn't know the bigger story. He didn't know that the Sherman tanks 3 miles behind him represented an industrial and doctrinal achievement that had taken America from 17th place to producing more tanks than all other combatant nations combined. He just knew that the tanks weren't there, and men were dying, and someone somewhere had promised that American armor would be the answer. The journey from that promise to reality would be written in blood, steel, and mud across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. It would involve catastrophic defeats that made generals weep, tactical innovations that rewrote doctrine in real time, and a learning curve so steep that every lesson cost lives. The American armored force that would eventually help destroy Nazi Germany didn't exist in any meaningful form when war began. It would have to be invented, tested, broken, and rebuilt while fighting the most experienced armored force the world had ever seen. This is the story of how a nation that entered World War II with obsolete tanks and no clear idea how to use them emerged with an armoured force that would set the standard for mechanized warfare for generations. It begins with failure, continues through adaptation, and culminates in a form of mobile combined arms warfare that even the Germans would study and attempt to copy. But first, it begins with defeat. February 14th, 1943, 5:47 in the morning. The Fide Pass, Tunisia. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters rolled out of his bedroll when the first German shells screamed overhead, but he was already too late. The 4th Armoured Regiment, 1st Armoured Division, had bivouacked in a valley that was about to become a kill zone, and the German 10th Panzer Division knew exactly where every American tank sat in the pre-dawn darkness. Waters, General Patton's son-in-law, and a West Point graduate who had studied armoured warfare obsessively, had the sickening realization that every tactical principle he'd learned at Fort Knox was about to be tested by an enemy who had already mastered those principles and evolved beyond them. The barrage lasted 7 minutes. When it lifted, German Mark IV panzers appeared on the ridgelines like apparitions, their long-barreled 75mm guns silhouetted against the rising sun. American crews scrambled for their Shermans, but scrambling doesn't matter when the enemy has already positioned for enfilade fire. This was going to be a slaughter, and Waters knew it before the first shot was fired. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was America's first major armoured engagement in the European theatre, and it revealed every deficiency, every doctrinal failure, every training gap that had been papered over by optimism and industrial capacity. The 1st Armoured Division was a good unit by American standards. Its men had trained hard, its officers were professionals, and its equipment was reasonably modern. None of that mattered. German forces under General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, though stretched thin and undersupplied, possessed something American armour lacked: combat wisdom earned through 3 years of warfare across Poland, France, and North Africa. They understood terrain, understood concentration of force, understood that armour's power came not from individual tank quality, but from coordinated manoeuvre and mass firepower brought to bear at decisive points. The Americans, by contrast, had scattered their tanks in what Doctrine called penny packets, small groups attached to infantry units, spread across miles of front, unable to support each other or mass for counterattack. It was deployment straight from World War I thinking, and it was about to be torn apart by World War II reality. Inside Sherman No. 307, Sergeant Mike Paulick experienced the technical shock that would define American tankers' early war experience. His crew spotted a German Mark IV Panzer at approximately 800 yards, a range at which their 75mm gun should have been effective. The gunner acquired the target, fired, and they watched the armour-piercing rounds strike the Panzer's frontal armour and ricochet skyward, leaving nothing but a bright scar on the German tank's glacis plate. Before they could reload, the German tank fired back. The round punched through the Sherman's frontal armour as if it were tin, passed through the fighting compartment, and exited through the rear in a spray of molten metal. Paulick and 2 crew members bailed out through the hatches. The driver and bow gunner didn't make it. The entire engagement, from first shot to catastrophic penetration, lasted 11 seconds. This scene repeated itself dozens of times across the battlefield that morning. American tankers discovered that their armour couldn't stop what German guns fired, while their guns couldn't penetrate what German armour protected. The tactical picture was even worse than the technical one. German forces had concentrated their armour into cohesive battle groups, Kampfgruppen, that combined tanks, artillery, infantry, and anti-tank guns into mutually supporting formations. When American tanks advanced, they encountered not just enemy tanks, but entire defensive systems. German 88mm anti-tank guns, positioned on high ground and expertly camouflaged, destroyed American Shermans at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards distances at which American crews couldn't even identify what was killing them. The German doctrine of employing anti-tank guns as offensive weapons, pushing them forward with the armour to establish killing zones, was something American planners hadn't anticipated. American forces, meanwhile, attacked in linear formations with inadequate reconnaissance, their tanks advancing without proper artillery support or infantry protection, violating every principle of combined arms warfare that had been written into doctrine but not yet internalized through practice. The result was predictable. By February 15th, the 1st Armoured Division was in full retreat. The radio discipline failure compounded every other problem. German signals intelligence units intercepted American radio traffic throughout the battle and found it laughably insecure. American tank commanders transmitted in clear voice, using no codes, often identifying themselves by name and unit designation. They discussed their positions, their fuel states, their planned movements, their fears, all broadcast on frequencies the Germans monitored continuously. One intercepted transmission from February 15th captured an American tank commander, reporting, "We're at the crossroads 2 miles south of Fayed, down to half fuel, requesting orders." Within 20 minutes, German artillery had that crossroads ranged and destroyed the tanks there. The Americans' excellent radio equipment, a technological advantage over German equivalents, became a liability because crews hadn't been trained in proper communication security. Every transmission gave the enemy actionable intelligence. The Germans, by contrast, maintained strict radio discipline, used landlines where possible, and employed coded brevity codes that revealed nothing even when intercepted. February 20th marked the nadir. American forces retreated 50 miles, abandoning positions, equipment, and all pretense of cohesive defense. The roads east became clogged with trucks, jeeps, tanks, anything that could move in a chaos that resembled rout more than tactical withdrawal. The 1st Armoured Division had lost 183 tanks in 6 days, along with 6,500 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. German losses, approximately 20 tanks and 700 men. The kill ratio was worse than 9-1, and the psychological impact went beyond numbers. American tankers, told they had the best equipment and the best training, had been systematically outfought by an enemy operating with inferior numbers and stretched supply lines. The myth of American invincibility, barely established, shattered against the reality of German tactical excellence. Veterans from Kasserine would later describe a pervasive sense of inadequacy. They'd done what they were trained to do, and it hadn't been remotely sufficient. Eisenhower's response was swift and brutal. On February 22nd, he relieved the senior commanders responsible for the debacle and sent for the one American general who understood armoured warfare both intellectually and viscerally, George S. Patton. Patton arrived in Tunisia like a thunderstorm, immediately instituting changes that ranged from the profound to the seemingly trivial, but were all designed to rebuild broken forces' confidence and competence. Every soldier would wear helmets and proper uniforms at all times, no exceptions. Tanks would be maintained to spotless condition. Officers would lead from the front. But beyond the discipline and showmanship, Patton implemented tactical reforms drawn from hard observation of what had failed. American armour would no longer be scattered in infantry support, but concentrated in division-level formations capable of massed action. Reconnaissance would precede every movement. Radio security would be enforced with draconian punishments for violations. Artillery and armour would be coordinated through dedicated fire support channels. Infantry would be trained to work with tanks, not simply follow them. The American way of armoured warfare was being rewritten in real time, informed by catastrophic failure. The validation came faster than anyone expected. On March 6th at El Gueta, reformed American units faced German attacks and this time held their ground. The same 1st Armoured Division that had broken at Kasserine, now reorganised and retrained, stopped German armoured probes using overwatch positions, concentrated fire, and proper combined arms defence. American tank destroyers, lightly armoured vehicles with powerful 90mm guns positioned on ridgelines and destroyed German tanks at long range, while Shermans manoeuvred to flanking positions rather than engaging in frontal duels they couldn't win. It wasn't pretty, and American losses still exceeded German losses, but the outcome was different. The Germans withdrew. It was a small victory, tactically insignificant in the larger North African campaign, but psychologically vital. American armour could learn, could adapt, could fight effectively. The question was whether they could learn fast enough, and whether the lessons would be applied before the next great challenge. Rommel himself provided perhaps the most damning and prophetic assessment in his after-action reports. The Americans, he wrote, possess excellent tanks and superb equipment. Their material superiority is overwhelming, but their tactics are amateur. They deploy armour as if conducting peacetime manoeuvres. They show courage, but no skill, aggression, but no finesse. Then he added a line that would prove more accurate than he could have known. If they learn from this experience, they will become formidable. Their industrial capacity gives them the luxury of learning through loss. We do not have that luxury. Rommel understood what the Americans were only beginning to grasp, that in industrial warfare, the side that could afford to make mistakes, absorb lessons, and return stronger, held an overwhelming advantage. Germany's armoured forces were magnificent, but they were also finite. Every veteran crew lost was nearly irreplaceable. Every destroyed panzer represented months of production. America by contrast, could lose an entire armoured division's worth of equipment and replace it within weeks. The instruction purchased at Kasserine Pass cost 6,500 American casualties and nearly 200 tanks, but it established principles that would guide American armoured warfare for the remainder of the war. Concentrate force. Never engage enemy strength when you can manoeuvre against weakness. Use terrain. Coordinate arms. Maintain radio discipline. These weren't revolutionary insights. They were written in every tactical manual, but they had to be learned in blood before they became instinct. The crews who survived Kasserine Pass became the cadre who would train the next waves of armoured forces. The officers who witnessed the disaster became the planners who would redesign American armoured doctrine. The institutional knowledge gained in those 6 days of February 1943 was painful, humiliating, and absolutely necessary. American armour had received its first real combat instruction, and it had nearly failed the course. The question remaining was whether the final exam, when it came in the hedgerows and forests and rivers of Western Europe, would find them better prepared. January 1942, the Chrysler tank Arsenal, Detroit, Michigan. Shift supervisor Sarah McKenna watched the assembly line with a mixture of pride and disbelief that never quite faded, even after 6 months on the job. Every 45 minutes, another M4 Sherman tank rolled off the production line, a 30-ton machine of war, assembled by workers who, 18 months earlier, had been building passenger cars and would have struggled to identify the difference between a transmission and a turret traverse. McKenna herself had been a secretary before Pearl Harbor. Now she supervised 300 women welding armor plate, installing engines, calibrating gun sights. The noise was overwhelming. Pneumatic riveters, electric welders, diesel engines, roaring to life for first start tests. The line never stopped. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The machinery of American industry transformed raw steel into tanks at a pace that would have seemed physically impossible to any military planner in history. This wasn't craftsmanship. This was mass production on a scale that redefined what was possible in modern warfare. The statistics told a story that bordered on the unbelievable. From 1942 through 1945, American factories produced 49,234 M4 Sherman tanks. Germany, with its vaunted industrial capacity and total war economy, produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks and 1,347 Tiger tanks in the same period. The numerical advantage wasn't 2-1 or even 3-1. It was overwhelming, absolute crushing, and it was deliberate. American military planners, studying the lessons from North Africa and coordinating with Aberdeen Proving Ground engineers, made a conscious choice that would define American armoured warfare. They prioritized production speed and reliability over technical superiority. This decision would be controversial then and remains debated now, but the mathematics were compelling. A Sherman required 14 months from initial design to first production model. A Panther required 24 months. A Sherman cost $44,556 in 1944 currency. A Panther cost $117,000 equivalent. You could build and field nearly 3 Shermans for the cost and time of 1 Panther. The moment this philosophy crystallized came in late 1943 at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, where a captured Panther tank underwent exhaustive testing by American engineers. The testing team spent 3 weeks examining every aspect of the German machine, and their findings were simultaneously impressive and troubling. The Panther featured sloped armor that provided superior protection, a long-barreled 75mm gun that could destroy any American tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, excellent optics, and sophisticated engineering throughout. It was, by almost every technical measure, a better tank than the Sherman. The engineers documented all of this in meticulous detail, then reached a conclusion that would guide American production for the rest of the war. Don't try to match it. The reason was simple mechanical reliability. During testing, the captured Panther suffered 3 major mechanical failures requiring workshop-level repairs. The transmission failed at 68 miles. The engine developed oil pressure problems at 112 miles. The final drive gears stripped at 141 miles. A Sherman routinely operated for 500 miles between significant mechanical issues. The conclusion was inescapable. Technical excellence meant nothing if the tank broke down before reaching the battlefield. This reliability gap had profound strategic implications that became clearer with every month of combat. A Panther had an operational availability rate of approximately 55%, meaning that on any given day, nearly half of all Panthers were deadlined for maintenance or repairs. Tiger tanks were worse, at 45% availability. Shermans, by contrast, maintained 85% operational availability. In practical terms, this meant an American armored division with 230 tanks could expect 195 to be combat ready on any given morning. A comparable German panzer division with 150 tanks could expect 82. The Americans achieved this through ruthless standardization. 90% of parts were interchangeable between Sherman variants. Engines could be swapped in the field in under 2 hours using standard tools. Track links, suspension components, transmissions all followed common patterns that made field maintenance possible with minimal specialized equipment. German tanks, engineered to tighter tolerances and more complex specifications, required workshop facilities and specialized tools for most repairs. The decision to stick with the Sherman, even when better alternatives existed, became controversial in 1943 when engineers completed testing of the 20 medium tank prototype. The 20 featured a more powerful engine, better armor layout, a turret-mounted 76mm gun as standard, and incorporated many lessons learned from combat experience. It was, by every measure, a superior design to the M4 Sherman. The Ordnance Department recommended immediate production. The War Department said no. The reason retooling production lines from Sherman to 20 would halt tank production for an estimated 8 months. 8 months during which Germany would continue producing tanks while America produced none. 8 months during which existing Shermans in combat would lack replacement vehicles. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. Continuing to produce an adequate tank was better than stopping production to build a superior tank. The 20 was shelved, the Sherman production lines ran uninterrupted, but the Sherman itself was far from static. The genius of American industrial production wasn't just quantity, but adaptability. Between 1942 and 1945, the Sherman underwent continuous evolution through dozens of modifications that didn't require halting production. The original M4A1 featured a welded hull and a radial aircraft engine. The M4A2 used a diesel engine for reduced fire risk. The M4A3 incorporated a redesigned hull with improved armor angles and a new suspension. Most critically, in early 1944, Sherman production shifted to wet storage ammunition racks surrounding the propellant charges with water jackets that dramatically reduced the catastrophic fire risk that had earned early Shermans their deadly reputation. The transition from dry to wet storage happened across all production lines in 6 weeks, with minimal impact on production rates. By comparison, similar modifications to Panther production took months and required extensive retooling. American tanks were improving in the field faster than German tanks could be improved on the drawing board. The logistics mathematics were equally stark and equally important. A Sherman required 5 gallons of fuel per mile, traveled terrible by civilian standards, but excellent for a 30-ton tracked vehicle. That fuel had to be shipped from America to England, then across the English Channel to France, then trucked to forward positions. Every gallon delivered to a tank at the front represented approximately 2 gallons burned in the transportation process. Multiply this by thousands of tanks operating simultaneously, and the logistical challenge became staggering. But it was a challenge American industry and organization could meet. The Red Ball Express truck convoy system, Liberty ships, the port battalions, the fuel pipeline construction across France all represented industrial and organizational solutions to industrial-scale warfare. Germany's logistics system, by contrast, still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport for supplies. The Wehrmacht in 1944 used more horses than Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1812. American armor didn't just need tanks. It needed the entire industrial ecosystem to keep those tanks fueled, armed, and moving. That ecosystem existed because American industrial capacity, protected by 2 oceans and never threatened by strategic bombing, could be devoted entirely to production rather than survival. The human element of this production miracle deserves emphasis. The Detroit tank arsenal employed 47,000 workers at peak production. Approximately 60% were women, many of whom had never worked in heavy industry before the war. They learned welding, learned to read technical drawings, learned quality control processes that ensured every tank met specification. Similar stories played out at the Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, the Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, the Fisher Body plant in Michigan, the Baldwin Locomotive Works, adapting their expertise to armored vehicle production. These weren't traditional defense contractors, but civilian companies that transformed themselves because the nation needed tanks more than it needed cars or locomotives or rail cars. The social transformation was as significant as the industrial one. Women proved capable of precision manufacturing work that conventional wisdom had insisted only men could perform, and they did it while maintaining quality standards that kept American tankers alive. June 6, 1944, Utah Beach, Normandy. The landing ships disgorged their cargo in waves that seemed endless to the German defenders watching from the bluffs. Sherman tanks rolled off the LSTs into chest-deep water, their waterproof fording modifications allowing them to drive directly from ship to shore. For every tank disabled by German fire, 2 more appeared. For every tank destroyed, 3 more landed the next day. A German officer captured at Saint-Lô later testified that the constant arrival of American armor created despair among German forces. They might destroy 10 or 20 American tanks in a day's fighting, but the Americans would replace them overnight. This was the operational calculus American production made possible. In June 1944, American factories produced more Sherman tanks than Germany produced of all tank types combined. The production line in Detroit alone was outproducing the entire German tank industry. This wasn't warfare. It was industrial mathematics, America turning the war into a question of which side's production could outlast the other's capacity to destroy what was produced. The final accounting would show that American factories produced more tanks in World War II than Britain, Germany, and the Soviet Union combined, though. Soviet production was itself staggering and deserves acknowledgement. But the American achievement was qualitatively different because of the global logistics involved. Soviet 34 tanks were produced in factories, often within hundreds of miles of the front lines. German tanks were produced in the Ruhr and had to travel hundreds of miles but across friendly or occupied territory. American tanks were produced in Detroit, Michigan, and had to cross the Atlantic Ocean in convoys, vulnerable to submarine attack, then be unloaded at ports, then transported across England, then loaded onto landing craft, then driven across the beaches of Normandy, then moved through contested territory to reach the front lines. The fact that this worked at all was remarkable. The fact that it worked so well that American armored divisions never lacked for equipment, that worn-out tanks could be replaced, that losses could be made good, that divisions could be kept at full strength, represented an industrial and logistical achievement that military historians would study for generations. Arsenal democracy wasn't just a slogan, it was a strategic weapon, and it decided the war before many of the famous battles were even fought. March 1943. Fort Knox, Kentucky. Second Lieutenant Robert Bob Callahan reported to the Armored School at 0600 hours on a Monday morning that would redefine everything he thought he knew about military training. Callahan was 22 years old, a college graduate who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor, expecting to become an infantry officer. Instead, the Army had sent him to armor, and now he stood in a formation of 300 other fresh-faced lieutenants, watching a Sherman tank crash through a wooden building at full speed, pivot on one track, and fire its main gun at a target 1,000 yards distant, all while a grizzled major with a North Africa campaign ribbon explained that this was what they'd be doing in 3 months or they'd be dead. The major's name was Harrison, and he'd lost half his company at Kasserine Pass in February. His teaching philosophy was simple. Peacetime training got people killed, so peacetime training was over. Every exercise would simulate combat. Every target would shoot back with live ammunition. Every failure would have consequences designed to approximate the permanence of battlefield mistakes. Callahan realized in that moment that the next 13 weeks would either prepare him to survive or identify him as someone who wouldn't. Fort Knox had been transformed from a sleepy cavalry post to the epicenter of American armored warfare in less than 3 years. In 1940, the installation had fewer than 100 tanks and trained perhaps 2,000 men annually. By 1943, it housed 1,700 tanks, employed 9,000 instructors and support personnel, and cycled 25,000 students through courses every 3 months. The infrastructure had been built at emergency speed barracks, training ranges, maintenance facilities, classrooms, and most importantly, hundreds of square miles of Kentucky countryside that had been converted into tactical training grounds. These weren't simple firing ranges. They were elaborate simulated battlefields, complete with mock-up villages, anti-tank obstacles, bunker complexes, and umpires who assessed damage using methods that approximated combat results. The Battle of Louisville, as instructors called the capstone exercise, was a 72-hour continuous field problem that simulated everything from breakthrough to pursuit to defensive operations, with opposing force units trying to destroy student tank platoons using every tactical trick German forces had employed in Africa. The curriculum had undergone radical revision after Kasserine Pass, informed by after-action reports rushed back from Tunisia by officers who'd witnessed the debacle. Out went classroom lectures on tank characteristics and mechanical theory. In came immediate immersion in tactical scenarios. Callahan's first week included no classroom time at all. He and his fellow students were simply assigned to tank crews and sent to the gunnery ranges with minimal instruction beyond operate the vehicle, engage the targets, don't die. The failure rate was spectacular. Callahan's first range exercise ended with his Sherman stuck in a ditch, its gun traversed in the wrong direction, having fired 0 rounds at targets that had destroyed his tank 3 times, according to umpire assessment. Major Harrison's after-action critique was brief. Lieutenant Callahan is currently dead, along with his entire crew. Recommendations for improvement. The message was clear: figure it out fast, because the enemy wouldn't provide second chances. But beneath the deliberate chaos was sophisticated instructional design. Every student who failed a tactical problem was immediately debriefed, shown exactly what went wrong, and sent back to attempt the same problem under different conditions. Repetition with variation, the same skills practiced in different terrain, different weather, different tactical situations. Gunnery training evolved from stationary targets at fixed ranges to moving targets at variable distances, with gunners required to achieve first-round hits against targets simulating enemy tanks at 800 yards. This was revolutionary for American military training, which had traditionally emphasized volume of fire over precision. Fort Knox Doctrine, informed by combat reports showing that tank battles were often decided by which crew fired first and hit first, demanded accuracy over rapid shooting. A good crew could identify a target, range it, acquire it through the gun sight, and put a round on target in 12 seconds. An excellent crew could do it in 8. Crews that took longer than 15 seconds failed the standard and were recycled through the training until they improved or washed out. The crew cohesion doctrine was another innovation that separated Fort Knox training from traditional army practice. In standard military training, individuals learned skills and then were assigned to units. Armoured training reversed this. 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and bow gunner, were assigned as a crew on day 1 and stayed together through the entire 13-week course. They learned to operate the tank together, troubleshoot mechanical problems together, sleep in the field together, develop the almost telepathic coordination that made effective tank operation possible. Callahan's crew consisted of himself as commander, Sergeant Martinez as gunner, Private Kowalski as loader, Private Williams as driver, and Private Chen as bow gunner. By week 3, they could complete pre-combat checks in 7 minutes without speaking, each man knowing his tasks and trusting the others to complete theirs. By week 8, Williams could identify terrain features in darkness by the feel of the suspension beneath his controls. Martinez could estimate range by comparing target size to known measurements without using the rangefinder, and the entire crew could execute a shoot and scoot maneuver, fire, reverse into cover, reposition in under 30 seconds. The instructors themselves were the curriculum's secret weapon. By late 1943, 95% of Fort Knox instructors were combat veterans rotated back from North Africa or the growing Italian campaign. They brought actual battlefield experience, actual tactical knowledge, actual understanding of what worked and what got people killed. Sergeant Major Williams, Callahan's platoon tactical instructor, had commanded a tank at El Ghetto. He taught the Panzer response drill, the sequence of actions when encountering German armor, with an intensity that came from having survived that exact situation. German tank spotted, 12 o'clock, 800 yards. Williams would bark without warning during field exercises. Crews had to react instantly. Driver halt or reverse to cover, gunner acquire target, loader confirm ammunition type, commander assess whether to engage or maneuver. The drill was repeated hundreds of times until it became instinct. Williams explained once, in uncharacteristic detail, why this mattered. At Kasserine, we took 45 seconds to react. The Germans took 15. That 30-second difference killed most of my friends. You will react in 15 seconds or you will die. Those are the only options. The failure rate was not an unintended consequence, but a deliberate feature. 18% of students washed out of armoured training, failed to meet standards, and were reassigned to other duties. This was 4 times higher than the 4% failure rate in 1941, before combat had informed the curriculum. The Army had made a conscious decision that it was better to identify inadequate tankers at Fort Knox than in combat, better to maintain high standards and face crew shortages than lower standards and send unprepared men into battle. Callahan watched classmates wash out for various reasons: inability to master gunnery, inability to handle the stress of simulated combat, personality conflicts that made crew cohesion impossible, simple fear that became debilitating under pressure. There was no shame in failure, instructors emphasized, only in failing to recognize one's limitations. A man who couldn't function in a tank might be an excellent infantryman, artilleryman, or engineer, but crewing a tank required specific aptitudes, and the 13-week course was designed to reveal whether students possessed them. The final exam was brutal and comprehensive. 72 hours of continuous operations, simulating a full tactical scenario from defensive positions through counterattack to breakthrough and exploitation. Callahan's crew received their operation order at 0300 hours on a Tuesday. Enemy forces had penetrated American lines. Their tank platoon was to conduct delaying action, then join a counterattack, then exploit through enemy rear areas to capture an objective 20 miles distant. For 3 days, they operated with minimal sleep, eating field rations inside the tank, conducting movement and combat while umpires assessed their every action. Other tank crews played opposing forces. Artillery simulators created the sound and concussion of incoming fire. Engineers placed live demolitions to simulate mine strikes. The exercise was designed to create physical exhaustion, mental stress, and the kind of friction that makes simple tasks nearly impossible. Callahan's crew completed the problem successfully, but barely. They lost 1 crew member to simulated casualties, had a track break requiring field repair under simulated enemy fire, and ran critically low on ammunition during the final approach to their objective. Major Harrison's assessment: adequate? You'll probably survive your first month in combat, we'll see about the second. The graduates of Fort Knox represented America's answer to the years of experience German panzer crews possessed. They weren't equivalent, no 13-week course could match 3 or 4 years of actual warfare, but they were competent, which was infinitely better than the unprepared crews that had gone to Kasserine. By mid-1944, the average American tank crew arriving in Europe had completed the Fort Knox course, or an equivalent program, had fired hundreds of live rounds in training, had operated their tank in realistic tactical scenarios, and had been taught by instructors who'd survived combat and knew what actually mattered. The question remaining was whether 13 weeks could prepare anyone for the absolute chaos, terror, and randomness of actual battle. Fort Knox had transformed American armor training from an amateur improvisation to a professional program, but training could only simulate war. It couldn't replicate the moment when real armor-piercing rounds punched through real armor plate, when real crew members died, when real fear and real confusion made every drill and procedure feel inadequate. The graduates boarding ships for England in spring 1944 had been trained to survive. They were about to discover whether survival depended more on training or on luck. July 11th, 1944, Normandy hedgerow country, 1,400 yards south of Carrington. Staff Sergeant Thomas O'Brien saw the Panther before his gunner did a dark angular shape materializing through the morning mist like a predator emerging from tall grass. The German tank sat motionless at the far end of a pasture, its long 75mm gun trained in O'Brien's general direction, and O'Brien knew with absolute certainty that everything he'd learned at Fort Knox about armoured warfare was about to be tested by a machine that was simply better than his. The Panther was 1,200 yards distant, maybe 1,300 extreme range for the Sherman's 75mm gun, under ideal conditions, and these conditions were far from ideal. The Panther's frontal armour was 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness of approximately 140mm. O'Brien's armour-piercing rounds could penetrate 68mm at 500 yards under perfect 90-degree impact. The mathematics were unforgiving. He could shoot at the Panther all day and accomplish nothing except revealing his position. The Panther, meanwhile, could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armour at this range and any range beyond it. The technical disparity between Sherman and Panther represented everything wrong and everything right about American armour doctrine simultaneously. The Panther weighed 45 tons to the Sherman's 33 tons, carried armour that was consistently thicker and better angled, mounted a gun that was superior in every measurable category, featured excellent Zeiss optics that gave German gunners clearer target acquisition, and incorporated sophisticated engineering throughout its design. In a frontal engagement at ranges beyond 800 yards, the Panther won, period. No tactical finesse, no cruise skill, no American advantage could overcome the fundamental physics of armor penetration and ballistic performance. This disparity had been known since late 1943, when captured Panthers underwent testing at Aberdeen. The question was what American crews were supposed to do about it. The answer, codified in field manuals but learned painfully in combat, was simple: don't fight on the Panthers' terms. O'Brien didn't engage. Instead, he reversed his Sherman into the concealment of the hedgerow behind him, radioed his platoon leader, and began implementing the tactical solution to a technical problem. The engagement that followed illustrated how American doctrine attempted to offset individual tank inferiority through coordinated maneuver. O'Brien's Sherman was part of a 5-tank platoon, and within 3 minutes of spotting the Panther, all 5 tanks were in motion, executing a maneuver they'd practiced dozens of times in training. The L-shaped ambush. 3 Shermans would fix the Panther's attention from the front, remaining in cover and presenting minimal target, while 2 Shermans maneuvered through the hedgerows to achieve a flank shot where the Panther's armor was vulnerable. It was textbook tactics, and it should have worked, except for one variable the Americans hadn't accounted for. The Panther wasn't alone. German doctrine never deployed armor individually. As O'Brien's 2 flanking Shermans reached their firing positions and prepared to engage, a German Mark IV Panzer, hidden in a tree line 900 yards distant, opened fire first. The first round struck Lieutenant Marsh's Sherman through the thinner side armor, penetrated the engine compartment, and ignited the fuel. The second round, fired 20 seconds later, hit Sergeant Kowalski's Sherman in the turret ring. Both American tanks were knocked out before they fired a shot. The tactical chess match had just become more complicated. But numbers mattered, and this was where American doctrine's emphasis on numerical superiority created opportunities. O'Brien's platoon lost 2 tanks in the opening exchange, but reinforcements were already arriving. A second platoon, hearing the engagement over the radio net, was approaching from the south. A tank destroyer platoon, M10 Wolverines mounting 3-inch guns with better penetration than the Sherman's 75mm, was repositioning to cover the western approach. American forces didn't fight fair, because fighting fair meant accepting engagements on German terms. They fought with mass, with artillery support called within minutes, with air support that could arrive within the hour, with the understanding that losing 2 tanks to kill 1 Panther was mathematically acceptable when replacement tanks were already en route from the beach depots. The German crew in the Panther, no matter how skilled, faced a calculus that didn't favor them. They might win the immediate tactical engagement, but the operational situation surrounded by American forces with limited fuel and ammunition meant even tactical victories led to strategic defeat. The rare occasions when Shermans achieved frontal victories over Panthers involved either catastrophic German errors or significant American advantages. On the same day O'Brien engaged his Panther 30 miles east near St. Lo, Sergeant Eddie Price commanded a Sherman mounting the new 76mm gun, a longer, high-velocity weapon that gave the Sherman genuine armor penetration capability against modern German tanks. Price's crew spotted a Panther emerging from a farm complex at 400 yards, a range where the 76mm gun could defeat the Panther's side armor. The engagement lasted 8.8 seconds. From target acquisition to kill, Price's gunner, Corporal James Washington, achieved a first-round hit that penetrated the Panther's side armor just below the turret ring, detonating ammunition and creating a catastrophic explosion that blew the turret completely off the hull. But this victory came with context. Price's Sherman was one of only 12 76mm variants in the entire division. The Panther had exposed its flank through poor tactical positioning, and the range was nearly point-blank by armoured warfare standards. The engagement proved the 76mm gun worked, but it also proved how rarely ideal conditions existed. The crew survival statistics told a story that complicated the narrative of American tank inferiority. A Sherman penetrated by armor-piercing fire had an 85% crew survival rate, a figure that shocked many who believed the Sherman was a death trap. This high survival rate came from several factors. The Sherman's spacious interior allowed rapid crew bailout. The post-1944 wet ammunition storage dramatically reduced catastrophic fires. The escape hatches were well-designed and numerous, and American doctrine emphasized crew survival over vehicle recovery. German crews were trained to stay with their tanks and fight them to destruction if necessary. American crews were trained to abandon damaged vehicles immediately. A Sherman might be destroyed, but its crew often survived to crew another tank. The Panther, despite its superior armor, had a 70% crew survival rate when penetrated, largely because its more cramped interior and tendency to suffer catastrophic ammunition detonations made escape more difficult. This distinction mattered. American armored divisions could sustain higher tank losses than German panzer divisions and still maintain combat effectiveness because the crews survived, retained their training and experience, and could be reassigned to replacement tanks that arrived within days. The rate of fire advantage the Sherman possessed was significant but often overlooked in discussions of tank versus tank combat. A well-trained Sherman crew could fire 3 to 4 rounds per minute from the main gun. A Panther crew could fire 5 to 7 rounds per minute. The German loader position was better designed, and the ammunition was easier to handle. But this technical comparison missed the tactical reality. Most tank engagements involve multiple shots at the same target, or sequential engagement of multiple targets. And in these scenarios, the Sherman's 3-round per minute capability mattered less than factors like crew coordination, target acquisition speed, and tactical positioning. More importantly, American Doctrine emphasized first-round accuracy over volume of fire. A Sherman crew that could identify a target, range it accurately, and achieve a hit with their first round gained an enormous advantage over a crew that fired faster but less accurately. Fort Knox training had hammered this principle home. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and the first accurate round matters more than the next 3 inaccurate rounds. The mythology around the Sherman's vulnerability to fire the Ronson lighter, nickname suggesting the tank lights the first time, every time, was both true and false in ways that reveal how battlefield legends form. Early M4 Sherman variants with dry ammunition storage did burn catastrophically when penetrated. The propellant charges for the 75mm gun were stored in unprotected racks along the sponsons, and an armor-piercing round penetrating the hull would often ignite this ammunition, creating fires that were nearly impossible to control. British Sherman crews, who used different fuel and operated in different tactical situations, experienced burn rates as high as 80% when their tanks were penetrated. This created the legend of the Sherman as a rolling crematorium. But by late 1944, American Shermans with wet ammunition storage reduced fire rates to under 20%. The wet storage system surrounded the ammunition racks with water jackets that absorbed heat and prevented propellant ignition, even when the racks were struck by shrapnel or small caliber rounds. The improvement was dramatic and saved countless lives, but the mythology persisted because human memory fixates on dramatic catastrophe more than statistical improvement. The actual American tactical doctrine for engaging Panthers and Tigers was codified in field manual revisions distributed in late 1944, and it read like an admission of technical inferiority that had been transformed into tactical advantage. The manual stated explicitly, avoid frontal engagements with Panther and Tiger tanks. Use numerical advantage to achieve flanking positions. Employ tank destroyers and artillery for long-range engagement. Coordinate with infantry to fix enemy armor in position. Use terrain to negate German range advantages. Call for air support when possible. The doctrine acknowledged that American tanks couldn't win toe-to-toe duels with German heavy armor, so it prescribed tactics that made toe-to-toe duels unnecessary. This was intellectually honest in a way that military doctrine rarely achieves, recognizing limitations, refusing to pretend those limitations didn't exist, and building tactical solutions around them. German doctrine, by contrast, assumed German technical superiority and prescribed aggressive offensive action that American firepower superiority increasingly punished. O'Brien's engagement with the Panther concluded 3 hours after it began, and the conclusion illustrated every principle of American armored warfare. The Panther never moved from its initial position. German fuel shortages meant tanks often operated as mobile pillboxes rather than maneuvering forces. American artillery, called by the forward observer, attached to O'Brien's company, saturated the area with white phosphorus and high explosive, forcing the Panther crew to button up and lose their situational awareness. 2 tank destroyers worked into position on the Panther's flank while artillery was falling. When the bombardment lifted, both tank destroyers fired simultaneously at 800 yards against the Panther's side armor. 1 round missed, one penetrated. The Panther brewed up military slang for the fire that consumed the vehicle. The German crew bailed out and were captured. American losses: 2 Shermans destroyed, 1 damaged and recoverable, 2 men killed, 3 wounded. German losses: 1 Panther destroyed, 5 crew captured. By pure exchange rate mathematics, the Americans lost, but the Panther was irreplaceable, while 2 new Shermans would arrive from the depot within 48 hours. The crew that had operated the destroyed Shermans would be reassigned to new tanks within a week. This was American armoured warfare in practice, accepting tactical losses to achieve operational attrition that Germany couldn't sustain. The technological conversation around American versus German armour quality would continue throughout the war and long after, but it often missed the strategic forest for the tactical trees. American tanks weren't designed to be the best tanks. They were designed to be produced in overwhelming numbers, maintained in forward areas with minimal facilities, operated by crews with months rather than years of training, transported across oceans and continents, and used in combined arms operations where the tank was one component of a larger system. German tanks were masterpieces of engineering designed for a type of warfare. Germany could no longer fight mobile, offensive, independent armoured operations conducted by veteran crews with extensive support. By mid-1944, Germany lacked the fuel for mobile operations, lacked the replacement crews to maintain veteran status, and lacked the industrial capacity to replace losses. The Panther was a better tank than the Sherman in almost every measurable way, but the Sherman was a better tank for the war America was actually fighting. Understanding this distinction required looking beyond individual tank duels to the operational and strategic context in which those duels occurred, and in that context, the Sherman's adequacy, combined with American numerical and logistical superiority, proved more valuable than the Panther's technical excellence. June 15th, 1944. The Norman hedgerows, 3 miles inland from Omaha Beach. Captain Richard Hayes watched his lead Sherman attempt to climb an earthen embankment that looked insignificant on the map and insurmountable in reality. The tank's nose rose at a 45-degree angle as the driver gunned the engine, tracks churning soil and grass, the vehicle's center of gravity shifting backward until the entire underside of the hull was exposed. 33 tons of steel bellied out on an obstacle that was supposed to be a farmer's boundary marker, not a tank barrier. Hayes knew what was about to happen even before the Panzerfaust round struck. German infantry had learned to position themselves in the Bocage's countless concealed positions, waiting for exactly this moment when American tanks exposed their thinnest armour. The Panzerfaust warhead hit the Sherman's belly plate, penetrated the quarter-inch armour there, and detonated inside the crew compartment. The tank shuddered, stopped, and began burning. 3 crew members bailed out, 2 didn't. This was the 9th tank Hayes had lost in 4 days, and the 2nd Armoured Division had advanced exactly 1,200 yards in that time. Someone in planning had missed something critical about the terrain they'd be fighting in, and that mistake was being paid for in blood and steel. The Bocage, ancient hedgerows that divided the Norman countryside into a maze of small fields, was a terrain feature that appeared in pre-invasion intelligence reports as a minor notation. Aerial photographs showed the field boundaries. French resistance sources described them as agricultural features. Nobody, apparently, had understood what they actually were or what they'd mean for armoured operations. A Bocage hedgerow wasn't a simple row of bushes. It was an earthen embankment, 8 to 12 feet high, 6 feet thick at the base, topped with dense vegetation that included trees, brambles, and growth that had accumulated for centuries. The roots extended 4 feet deep, creating a matrix of wood and earth that was nearly solid. Medieval Norman farmers had built these boundaries to mark property lines and contain livestock, and they'd built them to last. 800 years later, they were still there, turning every field into a fortified compartment, every intersection into a kill zone, every advance into a bloody crawl through a landscape that seemed designed specifically to negate every advantage American armour possessed. The tactical problem was immediate and fundamental. American armour doctrine emphasized mobility, maneuver, and the massing of force at decisive points. The Bocage made all 3 impossible. Fields averaged 150 yards across, too small for maneuver, too constricted for multiple tanks to operate together. The hedgerows blocked line of sight, reducing visibility to an average of 75 yards when tanks were designed to fight at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The earthen embankments were too steep for most tanks to climb directly. forcing them to use the few gaps between fields, gaps that were obvious, predictable, and where German defenders positioned anti-tank weapons and registered artillery. When tanks did attempt to climb the hedgerows, they exposed their vulnerable belly armor at the crest. When tanks tried to force through the hedgerows, they often became stuck in the root matrix, immobilized and helpless. The Norman Bocage, never considered as a military problem during invasion planning, had transformed American armor from an exploitation force into infantry support, struggling through a three-dimensional maze where every advantage belonged to the defense. July 11th, 1944, marked a particularly brutal illustration of the cost. The 3rd Armoured Division attacked through an area called the Haida Piece, attempting to advance 2 miles to capture a crossroads. The division committed 180 tanks to the operation. The attack began at dawn with artillery preparation that accomplished nothing. The hedgerows absorbed the shrapnel, and German defenders simply waited in their concealed positions for the bombardment to lift. When American tanks advanced, they encountered a kill zone that had been prepared with German thoroughness. Panzerfaust teams in every hedgerow, anti-tank guns positioned to cover the gaps, machine guns sighted to separate American infantry from their supporting armor. The attack gained 400 yards in 8 hours. 1 tank was destroyed or disabled for every 140 yards of advance. By nightfall, the division had lost 47 tanks, suffered 360 casualties, and failed to reach its objective. The next day, they tried again. The results were nearly identical. This was warfare that resembled the Western Front of 1917 more than the mobile campaigns planners had envisioned. The human experience of fighting in the Bocage needs emphasis because the statistics alone don't convey the claustrophobic horror of it. Tanker testimony from the period describes a specific kind of terror born from operating a vehicle blind. The commander, normally able to scan the terrain from his cupola and direct the crew, could see nothing but the wall of vegetation 20 yards ahead. The gunner, trained to engage targets at long range using optics, found his sophisticated sights useless when he couldn't see beyond the next hedgerow. The driver navigated by compass bearing and the seat of his pants, feeling his way through gaps he couldn't see until he was in them. 1 2nd Armoured Division sergeant described it as fighting in a telephone booth where the other guy can see you, but you can't see him until he shoots. The normal relationship between armor and infantry, reversed infantry, could infiltrate through the Bocage using its concealment, while armor became the vulnerable force needing infantry protection. Tankers who trained to fight at speed and distance found themselves operating at walking pace in engagements that happened at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. The Panzerfaust, Germany's infantry anti-tank weapon, found ideal conditions in the Bocage. This was a simple weapon, essentially a shaped charge warhead mounted on a disposable tube, effective to about 30 yards and requiring minimal training to employ. In open country, Panzerfaust teams could be suppressed by tank machine guns or supporting infantry. In the Bocage, German soldiers could position themselves in dense vegetation 10 or 20 yards from a tank's probable route, wait motionless until the tank passed, then fire into its side or rear armor, where penetration was guaranteed. The disposable nature of the weapon meant the German soldier could fire and then slip away through the hedgerows before American infantry could locate him. Casualties from Panzerfaust strikes were particularly devastating because the weapon's shaped charge created a jet of molten metal that turned the crew compartment into a killing zone. Tank commanders learned to operate with hatches closed, sacrificing visibility for protection, which further degraded their ability to navigate the terrain and spot threats. The solution came not from the Ordnance Department or the tactical planners, but from field innovation born of desperation. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin, a tanker in the 2nd Armoured Division, observed that the hedgerows defeated tanks because they forced the front of the tank upward, exposing the belly. What was needed was a way to cut through the hedgerow rather than climb over it. Culin welded steel prongs salvaged from German beach obstacles to the front of a Sherman, creating a set of tusks that could penetrate the hedgerow embankment. When the modified tank advanced into a hedgerow, instead of climbing it, the prongs cut into the earth and root matrix while the tank's weight and engine power pushed forward. The hedgerow was breached at ground level, keeping the tank horizontal and protecting its vulnerable belly armor. The modification worked spectacularly. Word spread through the division, then through the corps, then through the entire First Army. Within 10 days, more than 500 Shermans had been fitted with Culin cutters, or similar modifications fabricated by unit welders using whatever steel was available. The Culin cutter's impact went beyond simple tactical advantage. It represented a broader truth about American military effectiveness, the institutional willingness to adopt field innovations quickly and scale them across entire armies. A German sergeant might develop a similar innovation, but the rigid hierarchical structure of the Wehrmacht meant it would take weeks or months to be officially evaluated, approved, and distributed. Cullen's innovation went from individual experiment to army-wide modification in less than 2 weeks because American officers at every level recognized a good idea and had the authority and resources to implement it immediately. This adaptive capacity, this institutional flexibility that allowed junior enlisted soldiers to directly impact operational effectiveness, was a strategic advantage that complemented industrial capacity. It meant American forces improved continuously based on battlefield experience, while German forces often remained locked into pre-war doctrine, even when that doctrine no longer matched battlefield realities. The communication problem received a similar field solution. Tank-Infantry coordination in the Bocage required constant communication, but radio wasn't adequate. Infantry squads didn't all have radios, and even when they did, the noise and confusion of combat made radio coordination difficult. The answer was absurdly simple: an infantry telephone mounted on the outside rear of the tank, connected to the tank's intercom system. Infantry could pick up the handset and speak directly to the tank commander without exposing themselves by climbing onto the tank or trying to shout over engine noise and gunfire. The tank commander could give the infantry squad leader his perspective from the higher position, and the infantry squad leader could direct the tank's fire onto targets he could see, but the tank commander couldn't. This modification, like the Culin cutter, spread virally through American armored units because it worked, and because the Army's institutional culture rewarded practical solutions, regardless of where they originated. By late July 1944, American armored forces had adapted to the Bocage through a combination of technical modification, tactical evolution, and hard-earned experience. The hedgerow fighting would never be easy, the terrain still favored defense, and German forces still inflicted disproportionate casualties on attackers. But American units learned to operate in the Bocage environment. Tank infantry teams became standard, with squads of 40 to 50 infantry assigned to work directly with platoons of 5 tanks. The combined force would advance methodically. Infantry clearing hedgerows of anti-tank teams, tanks providing suppressive fire and breaching obstacles, both elements supporting each other in a way that had never been emphasized in training. The casualty rate dropped as tactics improved. The 2nd Armoured Division lost 1,348 men in the 33 days from July 1st to August 2nd, a horrific number that nonetheless represented improvement from the even worse casualties of June. More importantly, advances began to register on the map. Where early Bocage fighting measured progress in yards per day, late July operations began achieving hundreds of yards, then miles. The lessons of the Bocage would inform American armoured operations for the remainder of the war. The realization that terrain could completely negate technological advantages became embedded in operational planning. The importance of combined arms teams, armour and infantry working in intimate coordination rather than parallel operations became doctrinal rather than theoretical. The willingness to modify equipment in the field rather than waiting for official solutions became accepted practice. And perhaps most importantly, American forces learned that the enemy would always have some advantage, whether technical or tactical or terrain-based, and that victory depended on adapting faster than the enemy could exploit those advantages. The Bocage was America's second great tactical instruction, following Kasserine Pass, and like Kasserine, the lessons were paid for in casualties that made the instruction permanent. The men who survived the Bocage fighting became the experienced cadre who would lead the exploitation across France, and they carried with them a healthy respect for terrain, a deep appreciation for infantry armour coordination, and absolutely no illusions about easy victories or technological superiority, guaranteeing success. July 25th, 1944, 700 hours, Saint-Lô, France. Lieutenant Colonel William Duncan stood in a forward observation post and watched the sky fill with heavy bombers, flying in formations that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. 1,800 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, approaching in waves so dense their engines created a sound like continuous thunder. Duncan had been briefed on Operation Cobra, the Breakout plan that would end the Bocage stalemate, but briefings couldn't prepare anyone for the visual and visceral reality of this much concentrated violence about to be delivered on a 7,000-yard front. The target area was a rectangle of Norman countryside, currently occupied by German Panzer Division and elements of the 7th Army. In 20 minutes, that rectangle would cease to exist as a functioning military position. Duncan's 2nd Armoured Division would then exploit through the wreckage, and if everything went according to plan, American armour would finally be able to do what it had been designed for: exploit broken enemy defences at speed and depth. The question was whether the plan would survive contact with reality. The bombing began at 0720 minutes and continued for 90 minutes. 4,700 tons of high-explosive and fragmentation bombs fell on a target area measuring 7,000 yards by 2,500 yards, a concentration of explosive power that exceeded anything previously attempted in support of ground operations. German defenders who survived described the experience as apocalyptic. Continuous explosions that turned the ground liquid, air pressure changes that burst eardrums and lungs, shockwaves that killed men in bunkers without leaving external wounds, and a level of sustained violence that destroyed not just military capability, but the fundamental ability to function as organized units. Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite formations, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent force. Of the division's estimated 2,300 men in the target area, approximately 1,000 were killed outright, 800 wounded or concussed into incapacity, and the remainder so scattered and disorganized that they couldn't offer meaningful resistance. The divisional commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, reported to higher headquarters that his division was annihilated, a slight exaggeration but not by much. But the bombing wasn't perfectly executed, and American forces paid for that imperfection. Some aircraft released their bombs short of the target area, hitting American positions. The 30th Infantry Division, positioned directly south of the bomb line, suffered 111 killed and 490 wounded from friendly fire, a casualty rate that sparked immediate controversy and would lead to post-operation investigations. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre, died in this fratricidal bombing. The tragedy illustrated one of modern warfare's fundamental problems. The more violence you could deliver, the harder it was to control precisely. But even with the friendly fire casualties, the operational calculus favoured the attack. German forces in the target area were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. American forces, despite their losses, were prepared to exploit. The attack would proceed. The 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions began their advance at 1400 hours on July 25th, moving through the bombed area toward the Perrier-Saint-Lô road. The initial objective, what they encountered, was surreal. The landscape had been transformed into something resembling the moon craters, overlapping craters, vegetation stripped to bare earth, roads obliterated, every structure flattened. German equipment was scattered and destroyed, tanks overturned by blast effects, vehicles buried in collapsed bunkers, guns blown off their mounts. But crucially, there was no organized resistance. Individual German soldiers surrendered or simply wandered in shock. Units that should have contested the advance were gone, destroyed, dispersed, or withdrawn. By nightfall on July 25th, American armour had crossed the Perrier-Saint-Lô road and advanced 5 miles, a distance that had cost weeks of fighting to achieve in the Bocage. The breakthrough had been achieved. July 26th marked the transition from breakthrough to exploitation, and this was where American armoured doctrine finally operated as designed. Combat Command A of the 2nd Armoured Division, a task force of tanks, motorised infantry, artillery, and engineers organised for independent operations, received orders to advance as far and as fast as possible, bypassing resistance, seizing key terrain, and creating chaos in the German rear. The Combat Command covered 35 miles in 48 hours, an advance rate that shocked both American and German commanders. They operated on the edge of logistical sustainability, outrunning their supply lines, refueling from captured German dumps when possible, abandoning disabled vehicles rather than waiting for recovery, moving so fast that German forces trying to establish defensive positions found Americans already in their rear before they could deploy. This was blitzkrieg in reverse, American forces using German tactics against German defenders who had no answer to the speed and violence of the exploitation. The race created its own problems. By July 30th, lead elements of the 3rd Armoured Division reached Avranches, a city controlling the last intact bridge over the Sea River and the gateway to Brittany. The bridge could handle only single-lane traffic. Through this bottleneck, Lieutenant General George S. Patton intended to pass the entire Third Army, 12 divisions, thousands of vehicles, the largest operational force yet committed in the European theatre. Patton personally supervised traffic through Avranches, standing at the critical intersection in his jeep, directing military police, overriding traffic priorities, and keeping the column moving. For 3 days, July 30th through August 1st, American vehicles passed through Avranches in an almost continuous stream. German artillery could reach the bridge. German aircraft could have attacked it. A single successful interdiction would have stalled the entire exploitation. But German forces were so dislocated by the speed of the American advance that they couldn't organize a meaningful response. The bridge stayed open, the army kept moving. The fuel crisis that would later haunt American operations in August and September was already foreshadowing itself in late July. The 2nd Armoured Division's 35-mile dash consumed enormous quantities of fuel. A Sherman required 5 gallons per mile travelled, and the Combat Command's 200 tanks burned approximately 35,000 gallons in 2 days. Fuel trucks struggled to keep up with the advancing armour. Some tank units halted not because of enemy resistance, but because they'd outrun their fuel supplies and had to wait for resupply. The problem was mathematical and growing. Every mile American armour advanced from the Normandy beaches added to the supply line length, and every additional mile required more trucks burning more fuel to deliver fuel to the front. At some point, the advance would outrun sustainable logistics. But in late July, with German forces reeling and France opening before them, American commanders accepted the risk. Speed mattered more than sustainability. Exploitation opportunities were fleeting. The time to advance was now, and logistics would have to catch up. August 1st, 1944, marked the official activation of the Third Army under Patton's command and the transition from tactical breakthrough to operational exploitation. In the week from July 25th to August 1st, American forces advanced further than they had in the previous 6 weeks of Bocage fighting. The casualties told the story. The same divisions that had lost hundreds of men per mile in the hedgerows were now losing tens of men per mile in open country. The exchange rate for tanks improved dramatically, where Bocage fighting had seen American tanks destroyed at rates approaching 1 per few hundred yards. Exploitation operations saw entire days where armoured divisions lost single-digit tanks to enemy action. This was the warfare American armour had been designed for, and the results validated the design philosophy. Speed and mechanical reliability mattered more than individual tank quality. The ability to sustain operations without extensive workshop maintenance mattered more than sophisticated engineering. Numbers mattered more than technical superiority. But Operation Cobra's success created strategic consequences that would shape the remainder of the campaign. The German High Command, recognizing that American forces had achieved operational breakthrough, faced a decision: withdraw to defensible lines further east, or counterattack to cut off the American spearheads and restore the front. Hitler ordered counterattack. Operation Lüttich, the German armoured thrust toward Avranches, would begin on August 7th with the objective of severing American supply lines and trapping Patton's Third Army in Brittany. This decision to commit Germany's remaining armoured reserves to a counter-offensive rather than establish a defensive line would create the conditions for the Falaise pocket encirclement and the destruction of much of the German 7th Army. But in early August, as American armour raced across France, the German counter-offensive was still being prepared, and American commanders didn't yet know whether their breakthrough would lead to pursuit across France or another desperate defensive battle. The tankers who'd survived the Bocage and were now experiencing the exploitation felt the difference viscerally. Staff Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, whose Sherman platoon had fought through weeks of hedgerow combat, described the psychological shift. In the Bocage, you felt hunted. Every field was a trap. Every hedgerow hid something that could kill you. You measured progress in yards and counted it as victory if you survived the day. After Cobra, we were hunting. We owned the roads. German forces scattered when we appeared. We could see the terrain, maneuver, operate the way we'd been trained. It felt like the war had finally become what they'd told us it would be. This sentiment was repeated in letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies from armoured crews throughout First and Third Armies. The Bocage had been an aberration, a terrain-induced nightmare that violated every principle of mobile warfare. Cobra represented return to normalcy, a normalcy where American advantages in production, logistics, and numbers could actually matter operationally. The week from July 25 to August 1 represented American armored warfare's first strategic success in the European theatre. The combination of overwhelming air power, accurate artillery, infantry armor coordination learned in the Bocage, and armored exploitation executed at operational depth had achieved what 6 weeks of attritional fighting couldn't: the destruction of German defensive positions and the creation of conditions for mobile operations. The cost had been substantial. Operation Cobra produced approximately 40,000 American casualties, including the friendly fire deaths from the aerial bombardment, but the results justified the cost in the brutal calculus of military operations. German casualties exceeded 70,000, including prisoners. More importantly, the Bocage stalemate was broken. American armies were now positioned to exploit across France, and the question was no longer whether American armor could break German defenses, but whether German forces could establish any coherent defense before American exploitation reached the German border. The instruction of the Bocage, paid for in blood and frustration, had created the capability that made Cobra possible. The instruction of Cobra, proving that American armor could execute exploitation at operational depth, would inform every subsequent campaign through the end of the war. September 19th, 1944, 05:30 hours, Aricourt, Lorraine, France. Captain James Leach studied the fog-shrouded valley through his binoculars and tried to calculate how long he had before German armor appeared. The intelligence estimates said the 5th Panzer Army was massing for a major counteroffensive over 200 tanks, including Panthers and Mark IVs, supported by Panzer Grenadiers and artillery, with orders to recapture the Moselle River crossings and throw American forces back to the Seine. Leach commanded Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division, positioned on the high ground east of Aricourt, with orders to delay any German advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. His company consisted of 17 Sherman tanks, most mounting the newer 76mm gun that gave them at least theoretical parity with German medium armor. The terrain was what tankers dreamed of: rolling hills with good sight lines, firm ground that wouldn't bog tracks, an elevation that offered tactical advantage to whoever held the high ground. Leach had that high ground. The Germans would have to advance across open ground to reach him. For the first time since landing in France, American armor would fight on terrain that favored every advantage they possessed. The 5th Panzer Army's attack began at 0600 hours with an artillery barrage that was heavy by German standards in late 1944, but nothing compared to what American forces could deliver. The Germans were operating at the end of stretched supply lines, low on ammunition, and conserving shells for direct fire missions. When the barrage lifted, German armor advanced in columns toward American positions, and the tactical mistake was immediately apparent to every American observer. The Germans were attacking in parade ground formation tanks in neat lines, maintaining precise spacing, advancing at coordinated speeds. It was beautiful, professional, and exactly the kind of rigid adherence to doctrine that American forces had learned to exploit. The German commanders apparently believed they faced light screening forces that would retreat when confronted by massed armor. Instead, they were advancing into a carefully prepared defensive position with interlocking fields of fire, pre-ranged artillery concentrations, and American crews who'd been fighting for 3 months and knew exactly what they were doing. The engagement began at 1,500 yards when American tank destroyers on the ridgeline opened fire. The M10 Wolverine tank destroyers mounted 3-inch guns that could penetrate Panther frontal armor at this range, and their crews had perfect hull-down positions that exposed only the turret while the hull remained protected by the ridge. The first volley destroyed 3 German tanks, 2 Panthers and a Mark IV. The second volley, 20 seconds later, destroyed 4 more. German forces, trained to close range and use their superior optics and gunnery to win individual duels, discovered that closing range required crossing 1,000 yards of open ground under fire from positions they couldn't effectively engage. The attack stalled as German tanks sought cover in the limited terrain folds available. American artillery, already registered on probable approach routes, began falling among the stopped German vehicles. By 0630, the German attack had been stopped cold, with approximately 20 tanks destroyed or disabled, and American losses numbered 0. But the German 5th Panzer Army was a professional formation, and professional formations don't collapse from a single repulse. Throughout September 19th, German forces probed the American positions, attempting to find weak points or flanking routes. Each probe was met by coordinated American responses: observation aircraft spotting German movements and radioing positions, artillery striking concentrations before they could deploy, tanks shifting to threatened sectors along interior lines that were shorter than the German exterior approaches. The key advantage American forces possessed wasn't better tanks or better training, it was information. The 19th Tactical Air Command flew continuous reconnaissance over the Arakourt area, providing near real-time intelligence on German movements. Every German assembly area, every approach route, every staging position was identified and reported within minutes. American commanders knew where the enemy was and where the enemy was going before German forces could execute their movements. September 19th afternoon brought the largest tank engagement of the battle and the moment that validated every element of American armored doctrine. Approximately 40 German tanks, Panthers and Mark IVs mixed, attempted a coordinated assault from two directions, intending to fix American attention frontally while a flanking force struck from the south. The plan was sound, but execution was compromised by fuel shortages that delayed the flanking force and by American radio intelligence that intercepted German movement orders transmitted in partially encoded format that American signals units decoded within 20 minutes. By the time the German flanking force reached its attack position, 3 platoons of American Shermans were waiting in ambush on the flanks of the flank attack. The resulting engagement was as close to a turkey shoot as armoured warfare permits. German tanks, focused on their objective to the north, were struck by American fire from the east at ranges of 600 to 900 yards, close enough for the Sherman 76mm gun to penetrate Panther side armour, far enough that German crews needed several seconds to traverse turrets and acquire targets. 17 German tanks were destroyed in the first 5 minutes. The survivors retreated in disorder, and the frontal attack collapsed when its supporting flank attack disintegrated. The battle continued for 10 days, from September 19th through September 29th, and each day reinforced the same tactical pattern. German forces, operating with limited fuel and ammunition, attempted coordinated attacks that American reconnaissance detected early. American artillery and air power disrupted German assembly areas. When German armor reached American positions, they encountered prepared defenses with superior fields of fire. American tank destroyers and tanks mounting 76mm guns could engage at ranges where they were effective, while German attempts to close to their preferred engagement ranges exposed them to flanking fire. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. The 4th Armoured Division and attached units destroyed approximately 281 German tanks at Arakourt. American tank losses numbered 25. The kill ratio was better than 11-1, unprecedented in American armoured operations and comparable to German kill ratios in their most successful engagements of the early war. The weather conditions favoured American doctrine in ways that highlighted how much armoured warfare depended on factors beyond gun calibre and armour thickness. Late September in Lorraine brought rain, fog, and low clouds, conditions that negated German advantages in optical rangefinders and long-range gunnery, while having minimal impact on American operations. American crews, trained to fight at medium ranges with rapid target acquisition rather than precision long-range gunnery, adapted easily to reduced visibility. German crews, trained to exploit their superior optics and engage at extended ranges, found their advantages nullified. The weather also enhanced American air-ground coordination. Even in poor weather, American pilots could communicate with ground controllers who directed them onto targets using radio procedures that had been refined over months of combat. German forces, lacking equivalent air support and ground control networks, couldn't counter this capability. The tank destroyer doctrine that had been controversial in training and early combat proved its value definitively at Arakourt. American tank destroyer battalions equipped with lightly armoured, highly mobile vehicles mounting powerful guns operated exactly as designed. They positioned on terrain that offered good fields of fire, engaged German armour at long range, destroyed or disabled targets, then displaced to alternate positions before German artillery could range them. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, capable of 55 miles per hour on roads and mounting a 76mm gun, exemplified this doctrine. Hellcats would race to threatened sectors, engage from flanking positions, achieve kills, and withdraw before German forces could respond. This hit-and-run capability frustrated German commanders who'd been trained to expect enemy armor to remain in position and accept battle. American armor refused to fight on German terms, and the Germans had no doctrinal answer to an enemy that struck and vanished. The 5th Panzer Army's withdrawal on September 29th marked the end of active operations at Ardennes, but the battle's significance extended far beyond the tactical results. Ardennes represented American armored warfare operating under ideal conditions: good terrain, adequate supplies, air superiority, accurate intelligence, and an enemy forced to attack American positions rather than forcing Americans to attack German positions. These conditions revealed what American armor could achieve when all the advantages aligned. The 11-to-1 kill ratio proved that American crews, equipment, and doctrine were fully capable of not just matching but decisively defeating German armored forces. The battle validated the production over perfection philosophy. American numerical advantages and logistical sustainability mattered more than individual tank technical superiority. And it demonstrated that the learning curve from Kasserine Pass to Ardennes represented genuine institutional growth. American armored forces in September 44 were qualitatively different from American armored forces in February 43, not because they had better equipment, but because they had better doctrine, better training, better coordination, and combat experience that had been systematically analyzed and incorporated into tactical procedures. German commanders recognized Ardennes as a decisive defeat and attempted to draw lessons from it, but their conclusions revealed the limits of tactical excellence when strategic resources were depleted. The 5th Panzer Army commander attributed the defeat to American air superiority, which was true but incomplete. German forces had operated under air attack throughout the war and had developed extensive doctrine for mitigating its effects. What they lacked at Ardennes was fuel to maneuver away from airstrikes, ammunition to suppress American positions during attacks, and replacement tanks to replace losses that were now irreplaceable. The Germans could still fight skillfully, but skill couldn't overcome material deficit on the scale that existed by autumn 1944. One captured German tank officer, when asked why his unit had lost so decisively, replied with remarkable honesty, "We fought as well as we could with what we had. You fought adequately with everything you needed. Adequate plus everything beats excellent plus nothing." Ardennes would be studied in American armor schools for decades as an example of defensive armored operations executed nearly perfectly. The battle illustrated principles that would become doctrinal. Use terrain to multiply firepower effectiveness, employ reconnaissance to gain information advantage, coordinate artillery and armor for mutually supporting fires, maintain tactical flexibility to respond to enemy initiatives, and leverage industrial and logistical superiority to sustain operations the enemy couldn't match. But Ardennes was also exceptional. The convergence of favorable terrain, skilled leadership, adequate resources, and enemy mistakes created conditions that wouldn't be replicated consistently. The question facing American armor as autumn turned to winter in 1944 was whether the excellence demonstrated at Ardennes could be sustained when conditions were less favorable, when terrain negated advantages, when supplies were constrained, and when the enemy chose the time and place of engagement. That question would be answered in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December, and the answer would test every lesson learned from Kasserine to Ardennes. September 1st, 1944. Chateau Thierry, France, 40 miles from the German border. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., stood in the operations room of 3rd Army headquarters and stared at the map with the focused intensity of a man watching victory slip away for reasons that had nothing to do with combat. His armies had covered 600 miles in 26 days since the Cobra breakout, an advance rate unprecedented in modern warfare, liberating most of France, destroying German forces that couldn't retreat fast enough, and reaching positions where the Rhine River and Germany itself were within operational grasp. The spearheads of the 4th Armoured Division sat near Verdun, 90 miles from the German industrial heartland. 12 Corps was approaching Nancy, XX Corps threatened Metz. Every indicator suggested the German army in the west was collapsing, that one more concentrated push might end the war before Christmas. Except there would be no push. 3rd Army's fuel allocation for September 1st was 32,000 gallons. 3rd Army's daily operational requirement was 400,000 gallons. The mathematics were unambiguous. Patton's army was stopping not because Germans had stopped it, but because American logistics couldn't sustain the advance it had enabled. The fuel crisis of September 1944 was years in the making. though nobody fully understood the problem until the spearheads outran the supply system. The pre-invasion logistics plan assumed American forces would advance approximately 3 miles per day from the Normandy beaches, capturing ports as they went, with those ports providing the infrastructure for supplying advancing armies. By September 1st, American forces had advanced approximately 10 miles per day, bypassed most coastal ports, or captured them so damaged they were temporarily useless, and created a supply line that stretched from the beaches at Normandy to the German border, a distance exceeding 450 miles. Every gallon of fuel delivered to a tank at the front had to be trucked from Normandy because the French rail network was so thoroughly destroyed by pre-invasion bombing that it couldn't be used for heavy logistics. The trucks doing the hauling burned fuel, approximately half a gallon for every gallon delivered. The mathematics created an impossible equation. The further American forces advanced, the more fuel was required just to deliver fuel to the advance. The Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system established in late August to address the crisis, represented American logistics at both its most impressive and most strained. 6,000 trucks operated 24 hours per day on routes reserved exclusively for military supply traffic. 23,000 men crewed these vehicles, driving 800-mile round trips from Normandy to forward supply points, often operating with minimal sleep, inadequate maintenance, and deteriorating road conditions caused by the constant traffic. At peak efficiency, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily. This sounds enormous, until compared against Third Army's requirements. 400,000 gallons of fuel alone weighed approximately 1,300 tons. And Third Army also needed ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, and every other consumable modern warfare required. The Red Ball Express was a magnificent improvisation that couldn't possibly meet the demand placed on it. September 3rd brought the moment when operational success collided with logistical reality in a way that couldn't be ignored. Patton met with Supreme Commander Eisenhower at Chartres to argue for fuel priority. Patton's position was strategically sound. Third Army was advancing against disorganized resistance, positioned to breach Germany's western defenses before they could be strengthened, and needed only adequate fuel to continue exploitation that might end the war. Eisenhower's position was operationally sound. Every Allied army was facing the same fuel shortage. British forces under Montgomery were preparing Operation Market Garden to seize bridges across the Rhine, and concentrating all available fuel in one sector meant accepting stagnation in others. The meeting became heated. Patton reportedly offered to advance on foot if necessary. Eisenhower reportedly told Patton that even military genius couldn't run tanks on inspiration. The decision went against Patton. Fuel priority would go to Montgomery's 21st Army Group for Market Garden. Third Army would receive maintenance-level supplies, only enough to sustain positions but not to conduct major operations. The human experience of the fuel crisis needs articulation, because statistics don't convey the frustration felt by soldiers who'd fought across France only to stop within sight of Germany. Staff Sergeant William Chen, 4th Armoured Division, described watching his tank company sit idle for 3 days in early September while German forces visible on distant ridgelines reinforced positions that had been weakly held when American forces first arrived. We could see them, Chen recalled in post-war testimony. We could see German trucks moving, troops digging in, artillery being positioned. We radioed for permission to attack. We were told negative, conserve fuel. For 3 days we watched the Germans prepare defences, and then we spent 3 weeks fighting through those same defences. If we'd had gas, we could have rolled through with minimal resistance. Instead, we gave them time, and time was the one thing they needed more than we did. This scenario repeated itself across Third Army's front. The pause for logistics gave Germany the opportunity to establish coherent defences. The port problem compounded every other logistical issue. The nearest major port to Third Army's positions was Antwerp, Belgium, captured by British forces on September 4th, but not operational because German forces still controlled the Scheldt estuary that provided access from the sea. Until Antwerp's approaches were cleared, a process that would take until late November, the port couldn't receive supply ships. Other ports were either too damaged to use, too far from the front, or insufficient for the tonnages required. Cherbourg, the first major port captured, could handle 7,000 tons per day, useful but inadequate for armies that needed 30,000 tons daily. The engineers and port battalions worked miracles rebuilding shattered facilities. But civil engineering operated on timelines measured in weeks and months, while combat operations needed results measured in days. The gap between operational possibility and logistical capability grew wider the further East American forces advanced. The decision to prioritize Market Garden proved costly in ways that extended beyond Third Army's stalled offensive. Operation Market Garden, launched September 17th, attempted to use airborne forces to seize bridges across the Rhine at Arnhem and create a corridor for British armoured forces to exploit into northern Germany. The operation required enormous logistical support fuel for the tanks, ammunition for the supporting artillery, supplies for 3 airborne divisions dropped deep behind German lines. Market Garden failed. The bridge at Arnhem wasn't captured. British XXX Corps couldn't break through to relieve the airborne forces. The fuel and supplies dedicated to Market Garden produced no strategic result, while Third Army's advance, which had been showing results before being starved of fuel, sat idle. Whether concentrating resources on Third Army instead would have produced better results remains historically debatable, but the fuel spent on Market Garden represented opportunity cost that couldn't be recovered. Patton's response to the fuel shortage mixed official compliance with creative acquisition that bordered on unauthorized requisition. Third Army quartermasters developed remarkable talent for discovering fuel in unexpected places. Fuel trucks destined for other units sometimes found themselves rerouted to Third Army depots through paperwork errors that were never quite corrected. Captured German fuel dumps were exploited immediately rather than being properly inventoried and distributed through official channels. Other Allied units found their fuel allocations mysteriously short, while Third Army's reserves mysteriously increased. Patton maintained plausible deniability. He issued no orders for fuel theft, but his staff understood that aggressive acquisition would be rewarded rather than punished. One Third Army logistics officer later testified, "We understood the general wanted us to be entrepreneurial about supplies. If that meant fuel intended for someone else found its way to our tanks, well, our tanks were the ones doing the fighting." The actual consumption numbers illustrated the scale of the problem and why no amount of creative acquisition could fully solve it. A single armoured division on the move required approximately 30,000 gallons of fuel per day. Third Army in September consisted of 3 armoured divisions plus 6 infantry divisions with attached tank battalions, plus corps-level artillery, plus service and support elements, all consuming fuel, even when stationary, for generators, maintenance operations, and local movement. The bare minimum to keep Third Army alive was 100,000 gallons daily. To conduct offensive operations required 3 to 4 times that amount. From September 1st through September 30th, Third Army received approximately 3 million gallons total, an average of 100,000 gallons per day, exactly the subsistence level. During the same period, Third Army consumed approximately 800,000 gallons of captured German fuel and an unknown but substantial quantity acquired through unofficial channels. Even with aggressive supplementation, the Army was fuel-starved. The opportunity cost of the September pause haunts historical analysis of the campaign. When Third Army resumed major offensive operations in November, German forces had transformed the lightly defended positions of early September into the fortified zones around Metz and in Lorraine that would require weeks of bloody fighting to reduce. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western fortifications that had been minimally manned in September, was fully garrisoned and prepared by November. Whether American forces could have breached these defences in September and ended the war in 1944 is unknowable, but the strategic reality is that September's pause gave Germany time to recover from the near collapse of August. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, appointed to command German forces in the West in early September, later testified that the pause in American operations during September was a miracle that allowed him to establish coherent defences from what had been chaos. German divisions destroyed in France were reconstituted. New divisions were formed from training depots. Artillery and anti-tank weapons were positioned. The West Wall fortifications were manned and prepared. All of this happened during September while American armies sat immobilized by fuel shortages. The broader strategic question was whether the logistics system could have been organized differently to prevent the crisis. Some historians argue that capturing and opening Antwerp should have been the absolute priority in September rather than pursuing operations in multiple sectors. Others contend that the pre-invasion logistics planning was fundamentally flawed, based on assumptions about advance rates and port availability that proved unrealistic. Still others suggest that the entire broad front versus narrow front strategic debate missed the underlying issue. No Allied supply system in existence could have sustained a continuous advance from Normandy to the Rhine, regardless of strategic approach. The Red Ball Express, for all its achievement, was improvisation substituting for infrastructure. The absence of functioning railways meant truck transport, and truck transport over distances exceeding 400 miles couldn't deliver tonnages adequate for sustained offensive operations. The logistics problem wasn't solvable through better planning or different priorities. It was solvable only through time to rebuild ports and railways. Patton's frustration was strategic and personal. He understood, perhaps more clearly than other commanders, that wars had operational windows when enemy collapse created opportunity. September 1944 was such a window. German forces were disorganized, undersupplied, and demoralized. The Siegfried Line was penetrable, the Rhine was reachable. The conditions for decisive exploitation existed. But exploitation required fuel, and fuel required logistics that didn't exist. Patton wrote in his diary, with characteristic bluntness, "We can see the Rhine. We can reach the Rhine. We cannot sustain operations at the Rhine. Therefore we sit and wait while Germans prepare defences that will cost thousands of casualties to overcome. This is not war. This is logistics. And logistics is defeating us more thoroughly than Germans could." The assessment was harsh, but accurate. American operational success had outrun American logistical capacity, and the gap between what was operationally possible and what was logistically sustainable would characterize operations through the end of 1944. The fuel crisis illustrated a fundamental truth about industrial warfare. Battles were fought by soldiers, but campaigns were determined by logistics. American tank crews could be superbly trained, American tanks could be adequately capable, American doctrine could be tactically sound, but none of that mattered if the tanks couldn't move for lack of fuel. The September pause didn't result from German military effectiveness. German forces in the West were shattered and retreating throughout August and early September. It resulted from the physical constraints of delivering millions of gallons of fuel and thousands of tons of supplies across a supply line that stretched the length of France, using a transportation network that was either destroyed or inadequate. The paradox was that American logistical capacity was simultaneously the greatest ever assembled in military history and insufficient for the operational tempo American forces achieved. The Red Ball Express moved more supplies further distances than any previous logistical system, and it still couldn't meet demand. The lesson wasn't that American logistics failed, but that modern mobile warfare consumed resources at rates that exceeded even the most sophisticated supply systems' ability to deliver. October 6, 1944, Hürtgen Forest, German-Belgian border. Lieutenant Marcus Webb guided his Sherman between trees, spaced so closely that the tank's fenders scraped bark on both sides. The forest was unlike anything encountered in France, dense evergreens rising 75 to 100 feet, their canopies blocking sunlight and creating perpetual twilight even at midday, undergrowth minimal, but the trees themselves forming a maze that channeled movement into predictable paths. Webb's orders were to support the 9th Infantry Division's attack to capture the village of Schmidt, and already he understood that bringing tanks into this terrain was a catastrophic mistake. The Sherman's main advantage was its gun range, effective to over 1,000 yards. Visibility in the Hürtgen averaged 25 yards. The tank's second advantage was mobility, the ability to maneuver and mass firepower. The forest trails were so narrow that tanks could move only in single file, unable to turn around, committed to whatever path they'd entered. Every principle of armoured warfare maneuver, concentration, mutual support, standoff engagement was negated by terrain that seemed designed specifically to nullify armour's strengths and magnify its vulnerabilities. The decision to commit armour to the Hürtgen forest reflected either stunning tactical blindness or desperate lack of alternatives, depending on which historical interpretation one accepts. The operational objective was clear. First Army needed to reach the Rohr River dams to prevent Germans from flooding the river valley and blocking any advance toward the Rhine. The Hürtgen forest sat astride the approach routes to those dams. Intelligence assessments suggested German forces in the forest were limited. Therefore, attack through the forest, seize the dams, continue east. The logic was linear and ignored the fundamental question of whether the terrain permitted armoured operations at all. 3rd Armoured Division, committed to the forest in early October, would lose 50% strength by mid-November and gain approximately 3 miles of devastated woodland. The exchange rate, men and machines, for utterly worthless terrain represented American tactical doctrine at its worst. October 6th, Company A, 33rd Armoured Regiment experienced the specific horror of forest tank combat in an engagement that became representative of the larger disaster. 14 Shermans advanced in column along a logging trail toward positions reportedly held by German infantry. The trail was the only route through a particularly dense section of forest. Attempting to leave the trail meant immediate immobilization in the soft ground and dense trees. The German defenders understood this. They'd positioned a 75mm anti-tank gun at the trail's far end, covering the length of the approach. They'd registered mortars on the trail at specific points. They'd positioned Panzerfaust teams in the trees on both sides. When the lead Sherman reached the kill zone, German forces initiated the ambush with simultaneous fire from the anti-tank gun, mortars, and Panzerfausts. The lead tank was destroyed instantly. The second tank, attempting to reverse, collided with the third tank behind it. Mortars fell among the stopped column. Panzerfaust teams emerged from concealment and struck tanks from the sides. The entire engagement lasted 20 minutes. All 14 Shermans were destroyed or disabled. American casualties 11 killed, 18 wounded. German casualties unknown but minimal. The wreckage blocked the trail, preventing recovery, and sat there for 2 weeks until engineers could clear it. The forest environment created psychological effects that went beyond tactical disadvantage. Tankers described a specific claustrophobia born from operating a vehicle blind in terrain where death could come from any direction at ranges measured in feet. The tank commander, whose primary job was maintaining situational awareness, could see nothing but trees. The gunner's optics were useless by the time a target appeared at ranges where the gun could engage. The target was close enough to employ Panzerfausts or grenades. The driver navigated by compass bearing and hope, unable to see more than a few yards ahead, trusting that the ground would support the tank's weight and that no obstacle or mine waited in the next few feet of travel. 1 3rd Armoured Division crew testified that they operated for 4 days straight inside their tank, hatches closed, in nearly total darkness because opening the hatches exposed them to German snipers and tree-burst artillery. They ate, slept, and performed bodily functions inside the Sherman without exiting. 2 crew members developed symptoms resembling severe anxiety disorder. 1 had to be medicated and evacuated. This wasn't combat. It was endurance of sustained terror in a metal box that offered protection from nothing that actually threatened them. The artillery problem in the Hurtgen was qualitatively different from artillery encountered in other terrain. German forces employed tree-burst tactics, fusing shells to detonate in the forest canopy rather than on impact with the ground. The explosions showered shrapnel and white phosphorus over a wide area, getting around the armor protection that normally shielded tank crews from artillery. White phosphorus burned at temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees Fahrenheit and would burn through anything it touched, including steel. Tanks struck by tree-burst white phosphorus had the chemical rain down on engine decks, turret tops, and any exposed equipment, starting fires that were nearly impossible to extinguish. Crews who bailed out of burning tanks found themselves in forests filled with German infantry. Crews who stayed inside often died from smoke inhalation or burns. The choice was death by fire or death by exposure to enemy infantry. The statistical outcome was approximately the same either way. The weather compounded every other misery. November in the Hurtgen brought rain 25 days out of 30. The forest floor, already soft, turned to mud that could swallow a tank to the fenders. Trails that were barely passable in October became impassable swamps in November. Tanks attempting to leave trails to maneuver around obstacles became stuck and required recovery vehicles to extract, assuming recovery vehicles could reach them, which often they couldn't. The rain also created condensation inside the tanks, covering every surface with moisture, making the interior a damp, cold hell where crews developed trench foot and respiratory infections from days spent in wet clothing, breathing diesel fumes and propellant gases. The 3rd Armoured Division's medical logs from the Hurtgen show that non-battle casualties, men evacuated for exposure, pneumonia, trench foot, and psychological breakdown, exceeded battle casualties by approximately 20%. The forest was defeating men as effectively as German weapons. November 16th marked the commitment of the 5th Armoured Division to the Hurtgen offensive, and the results illustrated that no amount of fresh units could overcome terrain that negated every advantage American forces possessed. The division attacked toward Hurtgen village with orders to advance 3 miles and secure the road network. The attack began with artillery preparation that accomplished nothing except alerting German defenders that an attack was coming, shells detonating in the canopy, couldn't destroy bunkers, and fighting positions dug into the forest floor. When American armor advanced, it encountered German defensive positions, prepared with methodical thoroughness. Mines on every trail, anti-tank guns covering every approach, infantry with Panzerfausts in every tree line. The division gained 300 yards in 3 days. 31 tanks were lost. Casualty estimates exceeded 400 men. The attack was called off as a failure, and the division was withdrawn to reconstitute. The 300 yards gained represented approximately 100 yards per day, an advance rate slower than infantry could achieve on foot and purchased at a cost per yard that was unsustainable even by Hurtgen standards. The fundamental question that haunts any analysis of the Hurtgen campaign is why armor was employed at all in terrain that made armored operations impossible. Several explanations exist, none particularly satisfying. First, American Doctrine, by late 1944, assumed armor was integral to offensive operations. Every attack included tank support because tank infantry teams had proven effective in other terrain. Second, commanders may have underestimated the Hurtgen's restrictive nature until they were committed and couldn't withdraw without admitting failure. Third, the operational necessity of reaching the raw dams created pressure to employ every available asset regardless of suitability. Fourth, institutional momentum in large military organizations made it difficult to reverse decisions once committed. Whatever the explanation, the result was clear. American armor spent 2 months achieving negligible territorial gains at costs that would have been unacceptable in any analysis based on military effectiveness rather than operational necessity. The alternative, never seriously attempted, was bypassing the Hurtgen entirely or attacking it with infantry-only forces while holding armor in reserve for exploitation when the forest was cleared. Military theorists had studied the forests since the Franco-Prussian War and concluded that dense woodland favored defenders and negated mechanized forces. The lessons were known. They were ignored or overridden by operational pressures and doctrinal assumptions that tanks belonged in every attack. The 3rd Armoured Division's after-action reports from the Hurtgen explicitly recommended that future operations in similar terrain should not include armor except in very limited supporting roles on roads. Yet, when the division returned to forest fighting later in the war, tanks were again committed in strength. Institutional learning existed, but institutional implementation lagged. The human cost of the Hurtgen fighting both forest and armor operations combined exceeded 24,000 American casualties for territorial gains that could be measured in single-digit miles. The 3rd Armoured Division lost 3,000 men, approximately 50% of its strength between October and December. The numbers are stark enough, but they don't convey the specific waste of committing armor to terrain where armor couldn't function. Every tank destroyed in the Hurtgen was a tank that could have been employed effectively in different terrain. Every crew killed in forest fighting was a crew whose training and experience could have been applied in operations where they had a fighting chance. The Hurtgen wasn't heroic defeat or even tragic necessity. It was failure, operational, tactical, and institutional, that was recognized as failure by many participants even as it was happening, but which continued because stopping would mean admitting the entire offensive had been a mistake. December 16th brought relief to the surviving Hurtgen forces, not through victory but through crisis elsewhere. German forces launched the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and American units in the Hurtgen were pulled out of the forest and rushed south to meet the German breakthrough. The raw dams, the objective that had justified the entire Hurtgen campaign, remained in German hands. They would stay in German hands until February 1945. The 2 months spent dying in the forest achieved nothing that affected the strategic situation. The divisions battered in the Hurtgen, reconstituted with replacement personnel who lacked the experience of the casualties they replaced, would be thrown into the Bulge, fighting at less than full effectiveness. The ripple effects of the Hurtgen disaster extended far beyond the forest itself. It represented American armoured warfare at its nadir, the institutional failure to recognise when terrain made operations impossible, the doctrinal rigidity that required tank support even when tanks couldn't operate, and the command failure to halt unprofitable operations before they consumed entire divisions. The Hurtgen forest devoured American armour and gave nothing back, and the lessons learned came too late to prevent the bloodletting. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours, Losheim Gap, Belgium. Private First Class Raymond Novak was pulling guard duty at a roadblock when the horizon erupted in fire. The barrage was unlike anything he'd experienced in 4 months of combat, continuous, overwhelming, coordinated across what sounded like miles of front. Novak's position was with the 14th Cavalry Group, a light reconnaissance unit holding a thinly defended sector that intelligence assessments had classified as quiet. The assessments were catastrophically wrong. What Novak was experiencing was the opening bombardment of Operation Wacht am Rhein Watch on the Rhine, Germany's last great offensive in the West. By 0600 hours, German infantry had penetrated American lines. By 0700, the first German tanks appeared, King Tigers and Panthers emerging from the forest like prehistoric monsters, their guns already engaging American positions that had no weapons capable of stopping them. Novak's unit was being destroyed before most soldiers fully understood they were under attack. This was blitzkrieg, German style, and American forces in the Ardennes were about to learn whether all the lessons of the past 2 years had prepared them for the ultimate test. The German plan was ambitious to the point of desperation. 20 divisions, 200,000 men, 500 tanks including the new King Tiger heavy tanks mounting 88mm guns, would attack through the Ardennes forest, split the American and British armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. This wasn't tactical opportunism, this was strategic gambling. Germany's fuel situation was so critical that the offensive plan depended on capturing American fuel dumps to sustain the advance. The Panzer divisions had enough fuel to reach the Meuse River if all went perfectly, but not enough to retreat if anything went wrong. Hitler was betting Germany's last mobile reserves on a single throw. The attack sector was the Ardennes, the same forest corridor through which Germany had attacked in 1940, chosen because American forces held it lightly, considering it unsuitable for major armoured operations. German planners were counting on surprise, speed, and the weather forecast, promising fog and low clouds that would ground Allied air power. December 17th brought the deepest penetration and the greatest crisis. Kampfgruppe Paper, a battle group built around the 1st SS Panzer Division and including King Tiger tanks, advanced 30 miles in the first 48 hours, crushing American roadblocks, bypassing strong points, driving deep into the American rear. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper's force represented German armoured warfare at its most effective. Veteran crews, powerful tanks, aggressive leadership, and complete tactical surprise. American forces in Peiper's path were destroyed, scattered, or captured. The roads west were open. The Meuse River, the first major objective, was visible on maps, if not yet within reach, but fuel was already becoming critical. Peiper's tanks had consumed most of their basic load. They needed to capture American fuel dumps to continue. The entire offensive's success depended on logistics captured from the enemy, a plan that indicated desperation more than strategic coherence. December 19th marked the American response, and it illustrated what American armoured forces had become since Kasserine Pass. Third Army, fighting in Lorraine, 90 miles south of the German breakthrough, received orders to disengage, pivot 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the southern flank of the German penetration. This maneuver, reorienting an entire army of 3 corps, 6 divisions, and over 130,000 men with supporting artillery and logistics, executing the movement in winter conditions on icy roads, and attacking in a completely different direction within 72 hours, would have been considered impossible by military planners in any previous war. Patton's staff had anticipated the order and prepared contingency plans. When Eisenhower directed Patton to attack north, Patton replied that he could attack in 48 hours. Eisenhower, thinking Patton was posturing, told him to be realistic. Patton said 48 hours was realistic. He wasn't exaggerating. Third Army began movement December 19th and attacked December 22nd. The armoured warfare in the Bulge differed fundamentally from earlier campaigns because American forces were fighting defensively and in winter conditions that negated many advantages. The 4th Armoured Division, leading Third Army's counterattack toward the encircled garrison at Bastogne, advanced through blizzard conditions with visibility measured in yards, temperatures hovering between 10 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and roads that were sheets of ice. Tank engines that could start in these conditions required hours of pre-warming using portable heaters. Tank crews operated in conditions where exposed metal caused frostbite on contact. The cold affected everything. Guns that were harder to traverse because lubricants thickened, ammunition that performed inconsistently because propellant burned differently at extreme temperatures, optics that fogged and frosted, and human performance degraded by cold that caused mistakes and slowed reactions. German forces faced the same conditions, but they were defending prepared positions while Americans attacked, and attacking in winter consumed more fuel and created more mechanical stress. December 22nd through 26th saw the 4th Armoured Division's relief of Bastogne, 150 miles of movement and combat through German-held territory in 7 days, culminating in the breakthrough that reached the encircled garrison. The division's Combat Command B, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, led the final push. Abrams' task force consisted of tanks, tank destroyers, armoured infantry, and engineers organised into a mobile striking force that would punch through German lines surrounding Bastogne. The German defenders were no longer the shattered remnants encountered in France. These were veteran divisions pulled from the Eastern Front, equipped with the best weapons Germany still produced, fighting to hold what their offensive had gained. The battle for each village, each crossroads, each mile toward Bastogne was contested with intensity that matched or exceeded anything earlier in the war. December 26th, 1645 hours, Lieutenant Charles Bocage, commanding a Sherman in the lead element of Combat Command B, spotted American troops in Bastogne's perimeter. His tank, part of a 5-tank platoon, had fought through 3 miles of German defensive positions in the past 6 hours. The relief of Bastogne was both tactical victory and symbolic achievement, proof that American forces could respond to crisis, execute complex maneuvers in terrible conditions, and defeat German attempts to recreate the blitzkrieg conditions that had won earlier campaigns. But the relief didn't end the battle. German forces continued attacking through January, attempting to cut the corridor to Bastogne, expand the salient, or at minimum, inflict maximum casualties before the offensive collapsed. American forces, now reinforced and with clearing weather allowing air support, systematically compressed the German penetration. The fuel irony was not lost on anyone who understood the operational situation. German armoured forces ran out of fuel approximately 15 miles from the Meuse River, having failed to capture the American fuel dumps their offensive depended on. Piper's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead that advanced furthest, was destroyed largely because it couldn't refuel tanks, abandoned in place when fuel ran out, crews retreating on foot. This was the fuel crisis Third Army had experienced in September, but far more catastrophic because German forces had no reserves, no logistics system capable of delivering fuel forward, and no time to wait for supplies that didn't exist. American forces, fighting in winter and in difficult terrain, still managed to sustain operations because the logistics system, strained but functional, could deliver adequate supplies. The Red Ball Express and its successors, operating in snow and ice, kept American tanks moving, while German tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel. The final accounting of the Bulge battle told multiple stories. American tank losses exceeded 700 vehicles, German tank losses exceeded 600. By pure numbers, the exchange was nearly equal. But the context made the numbers meaningful. American losses were replaced within weeks from production and depot stocks. German losses were irreplaceable. The King, Tigers, and Panthers destroyed in the Bulge represented Germany's last significant armoured reserve. The veteran crews, killed or captured in the offensive, couldn't be replaced because Germany had no training capacity left to produce equivalents. American divisions battered in the Bulge were reconstituted with replacement personnel and equipment and returned to combat at full strength. German divisions destroyed in the offensive were disbanded, their survivors used to fill out other depleted units. The exchange rate that had seemed roughly equal was, in strategic terms, decisively in America's favour. The Bulge tested whether American armoured doctrine, developed through years of combat, refined through multiple campaigns, and based on principles learned from failure, could function under the worst possible conditions. The answer was nuanced. American forces responded with impressive speed, moving entire armies in conditions that should have made large-scale manoeuvre impossible. Tank-Infantry coordination that had been learned painfully in the Bocage functioned well, even in new terrain. Combined arms operations incorporating artillery, air power, and armour worked when weather permitted. But American forces also took heavy casualties, lost significant equipment, and required nearly 6 weeks to reduce the German salient. The victory wasn't clean or cheap. It was competent. American forces did what needed to be done, paid the necessary price, and achieved the strategic objective of destroying Germany's last offensive capability. Patton's performance in the Bulge burnished his reputation but also revealed the human cost of rapid maneuver. Third Army's pivot and attack were executed with remarkable speed, but that speed came from pushing men and machines to their limits. Vehicles broke down from the stress of winter operations. Men suffered from exposure and exhaustion. The attack toward Bastogne succeeded, but at casualty rates that would have been unsustainable in a longer campaign. The 4th Armoured Division lost over 2,000 men in the relief operation, approximately one-third of its strength, and required weeks to reconstitute. The manoeuvre was brilliant. The cost was high. The tension between operational excellence and human sustainability was never resolved. December 1944 marked the last time German forces would conduct strategic offensive operations in World War II. The Bulge consumed Germany's armour reserve, expended irreplaceable fuel and ammunition stocks, and achieved nothing of strategic value. American forces, tested under the worst conditions they'd face in Europe, proved capable of responding to crisis, adapting to unexpected situations, and defeating German forces even when those forces held tactical advantages of terrain, weather, and surprise. The lessons of Kasserine, the Bocage, Lorraine, and the Hurtgen all appeared in the Bulge fighting, sometimes as remembered wisdom, sometimes as painful relearning, always as the accumulated experience that separated late-war American armour from the amateur force that had landed in North Africa. The final months of the war would see American armour operating at peak effectiveness, but the peak was built on foundation of every earlier battle, every mistake learned from, every tactical innovation adopted, and every casualty that had taught the survivors how to fight and win. March 7th, 1945, 1500 hours, Remagen, Germany. Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led his infantry platoon toward the Ludendorff Bridge spanning the Rhine River and couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The bridge was intact. German engineers were running across it, presumably to set demolition charges, but the structure still stood 650 feet of steel railroad bridge that was supposed to have been destroyed days ago, according to German defensive doctrine. Behind Timmermann's infantry platoon, elements of the 9th Armoured Division were approaching fast. The Rhine River was the last major natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland. Every Allied plan assumed the crossing would be opposed, requiring elaborate preparation, massive artillery support, and coordinated air and ground assault. Instead, through a combination of German command confusion and extraordinary fortune, American forces had stumbled onto an intact bridge. Timmermann received orders immediately: take the bridge before the Germans blow it. At 1600 hours, American infantry began crossing. At 1615, the first Sherman tank rolled onto the Ludendorff Bridge. The Rhine crossing, expected to be the war's bloodiest operation, had begun almost accidentally. The Remagen Bridge capture was militarily fortunate but strategically complicated. The bridgehead was in a sector where no major offensive was planned. The terrain beyond the Rhine at Remagen didn't lead directly to critical objectives, but Eisenhower recognized opportunity when he saw it. Within 24 hours of the bridge's capture, he'd ordered maximum exploitation. By March 8th, 8,000 troops had crossed. By March 9th, the bridgehead was 8 miles deep. Engineers were constructing tactical bridges alongside the damaged Ludendorff to increase traffic capacity. The German high command was in panic. The Rhine barrier had been breached, and every hour the bridgehead expanded made elimination more difficult. German forces launched desperate counterattacks, including experimental V-2 rocket strikes and even attempted frogmen demolition, all of which failed. The bridge itself collapsed on March 17th from accumulated damage and heavy use, but by then 6 pontoon bridges and 2 heavy treadway bridges were operational. The Rhine barrier had been irrevocably compromised. March 23rd brought Operation Plunder, the planned Rhine crossing north of Remagen, where British and American forces had spent weeks preparing the most elaborate river crossing operation in military history. Montgomery's 21st Army Group and the US 9th Army would cross on a 25-mile front supported by 250,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and the most concentrated artillery bombardment yet delivered in Western Europe. The contrast with Remagen was instructive. Remagen was opportunity seized with minimal preparation. Plunder was methodical planning executed with overwhelming force. Both approaches worked, which suggested that by March 1945, American and British forces had achieved such superiority that the method mattered less than the resources applied. The Rhine wasn't conquered. It was overwhelmed by industrial capacity that Germany couldn't match or counter. The artillery preparation for plunder illustrated how far American combined arms coordination had evolved since North Africa. 3,000 guns opened fire at 2100 hours on March 23rd, delivering a bombardment that was carefully orchestrated rather than simply massive. Counter-battery fire struck German artillery positions identified through weeks of reconnaissance. Smoke shells created concealment for the crossing forces. High-explosive shells targeted German defensive positions identified through aerial photography and prisoner interrogation. The guns fired in carefully timed sequences that allowed forward observers to assess damage and adjust targeting. This wasn't the indiscriminate bombardment of earlier wars, but precision application of firepower coordinated with maneuver forces that would exploit the bombardment's effects. The Germans facing this onslaught described it as hellish, but more importantly, they described it as inescapable. There was no position within the target area that wasn't under fire, no defensive measure that could survive the concentration of violence. March 24th saw the airborne component Operation Varsity, which dropped 2 divisions behind German lines to seize bridges and high ground that would facilitate the ground forces' advance. The coordination between airborne forces dropping at 1000 hours and armoured forces breaking out from the Rhine bridgeheads was synchronised to 15-minute precision. Tanks were supposed to reach the airborne perimeter by 1300 hours. They reached it at 1245. This level of temporal coordination, different units executing different missions, arriving at the same place within minutes of scheduled time, represented operational sophistication that was remarkable considering the scale and complexity. Earlier in the war, coordinating armour and airborne forces within the same day would have been considered successful. By March 45, coordination within minutes was expected and achieved. The breakthrough from the Rhine bridgeheads demonstrated American armoured forces operating at peak effectiveness. The 9th Armoured Division's combat commands advanced 90 miles in 6 days, from March 25th through March 31st, overrunning German defensive positions before they could be fully prepared, seizing crossroads and towns that controlled road networks, and creating chaos in German rear areas that prevented coherent defence. This was exploitation doctrine executed as designed, armoured forces punching through broken defences and advancing at speeds that prevented enemy reorganisation. The advance rate, 15 miles per day, sustained over nearly a week, matched the best performances of Patton's Third Army in France and exceeded German blitzkrieg advance rates from 1940. The difference was that German forces in 1940 faced enemies that collapsed. American forces in March 45 faced enemies that fought but lacked the resources to stop mobile operations executed with overwhelming force. The casualties comparison between Rhine crossings and earlier river crossing operations illustrated how American operational capability had improved. The Rhine crossings from Remagen through Plunder produced approximately 1,200 American casualties in the first 48 hours. D-Day in Normandy had produced over 10,000 casualties on the first day. The difference wasn't that Rhine defences were weaker, German forces fought hard, but that American forces had learned how to overwhelm defences through coordinated application of artillery, armour, infantry, engineers, and air power in ways that minimised exposure to defensive fires. The engineers at the Rhine demonstrated this learning. They constructed tactical bridges under fire using techniques refined through 9 months of European combat. Bridge construction times that had required 48 hours in September 44 were completed in 18 hours in March 45. Every specialty within the American military had learned from experience and improved performance based on that learning. The air-ground coordination at the Rhine represented capabilities that would have been impossible earlier in the war. The 2nd Tactical Air Force flew 7,000 sorties on March 23rd and 24th, striking German positions, interdicting reinforcements, and providing close air support to advancing ground forces. The coordination was enabled by systems developed incrementally throughout the campaign, forward air controllers embedded with ground units, radio networks linking ground and air elements, standardized procedures for requesting and delivering air support, and pilot training that emphasized support to ground forces rather than independent air operations. German ground forces facing this coordination described fighting under conditions where American air power was omnipresent. Any concentration of forces drew airstrikes within minutes. Any movement in daylight was detected and attacked, and defensive positions were visible from the air and therefore vulnerable to precision bombing. The human experience of the Rhine crossing from an armoured crew's perspective showed how much confidence had grown since earlier operations. Staff Sergeant Robert Callahan, now a tank commander in the 2nd Armoured Division and a Fort Knox graduate from 2 years prior, described crossing the Rhine as almost routine. The statement wasn't boastful, but reflected genuine change in expectation. "We knew the plan," Callahan testified post-war. "We knew our role. We'd done river crossings before. We had air support, artillery support, engineers building bridges, infantry clearing the far bank. We were part of a system that worked. The fear was still there, you could still die, but the chaos was gone. We knew what we were doing, we trusted the plan, and we executed." This confidence, born from repeated success and institutional learning, was itself a force multiplier. Crews that believed in their mission and their capabilities performed better than crews operating in uncertainty. The comparison between American and Soviet Rhine crossings is instructive. Soviet forces crossed the Oder River in January and February 1945, facing German defences that were, if anything, more desperate and intensive than those in the West. Soviet casualties in the Oder crossings exceeded 30,000 in the first week. American and British casualties in all Rhine crossings combined totaled under 5,000. The difference partly reflected the intensity of German resistance. Germany defended its eastern approaches more desperately than its western approaches, but also reflected different operational approaches. Soviet Doctrine accepted casualties as inevitable cost of breakthrough. American Doctrine sought to minimize casualties through firepower superiority and coordination. Neither approach was wrong in absolute terms, but the American approach was more sustainable and reflected the values of a democracy that couldn't easily accept mass casualties. March 31st marked the point where the Rhine crossing transitioned from tactical operation to strategic breakthrough. American and British forces had established bridgeheads along the river's entire length from Switzerland to the Netherlands. German forces west of the Rhine had been destroyed or captured, over 325,000 prisoners taken in 3 weeks. The industrial Ruhr region was encircled. The road to Berlin was open, though political decisions would determine whether Western forces advanced that far. From a purely military perspective, Germany's ability to conduct coherent defense had collapsed. Remaining operations would be pursuit and mopping up rather than contested battles. The Rhine crossing was the last major obstacle American armor would face in Europe. The Rhine crossings demonstrated what American armored forces had become by March 1945. A mature, combined arms force capable of executing complex operations with high reliability, minimal casualties relative to results achieved, and operational tempo that enemy forces couldn't match. The journey from Kasserine Pass in February 1943 to the Rhine in March 1945 represented transformation from amateur to professional, from tentative to confident, from learning through failure to succeeding through competence. The specific capabilities that enabled this transformation were both technical and institutional. Better equipment than in 1943, but more importantly, better doctrine, better training, better coordination between branches, better understanding of how to integrate firepower and maneuver. The Sherman tank was still the same basic design from 1942. The crews operating it had changed completely, and that change in skill, confidence, and institutional knowledge mattered more than any technical improvement could have provided. April 1st, 1945, Weser River, Central Germany. Colonel John C. Wellborn, commanding Combat Command B of the 2nd Armoured Division, stood on the eastern bank of yet another river obstacle and marvelled at how perfunctory the crossing had become. The Weser was a significant barrier over 300 feet wide, deep enough to require bridging, defended by German forces that included Volkssturm, militia, and scattered regular army units. 2 months ago, crossing a river this size would have required days of preparation, massive artillery support, and anticipated significant casualties. Today, American engineers had bridges under construction before the infantry finished clearing the far bank. Artillery fire was precise and economical, no massive bombardments, just targeted strikes on identified positions. And the German defense, while determined in individual cases, lacked the coherence and sustainability to contest the crossing for more than hours. By 1400 hours, American armor was across the Weser and advancing east at speeds that made earlier campaigns look cautious. The pace of advance in April 1945 was surreal, even to veterans who'd participated in the Cobra Breakout and the race across France. The 2nd Armoured Division covered 250 miles in 18 days, from April 1st through April 19th. Daily advance rates routinely exceeded 15 miles, with some days seeing advances of 25 to 30 miles. This wasn't unopposed movement. German forces fought rearguard actions, attempted ambushes, and defended some towns with genuine ferocity. But coherent defense was impossible. German units lacked fuel for mobile operations, ammunition for sustained engagement, and most critically, the organizational structure to coordinate defensive efforts across multiple sectors. What remained was courage without capability, determination without resources, and tactical proficiency without strategic support. Individual German soldiers and small units could still fight skillfully, but skills didn't matter when the entire military structure supporting those skills had collapsed. The nature of resistance varied dramatically based on who was defending. Wehrmacht regular army units, when encountered, often fought briefly before withdrawing or surrendering. These were professional soldiers who understood the war was lost and saw no point in dying for symbolic stands. Waffen-SS units fought with fanatical intensity regardless of tactical situation, often accepting annihilation rather than surrender. Volkssturm units militia, composed of boys too young and men too old for regular military service, varied wildly in effectiveness, from units that fought surprisingly well to units that dissolved at first contact. American tankers learned to assess enemy composition quickly because it predicted behavior. Regular Wehrmacht, brief firefight, then surrender. SS, destroy them or bypass them, don't expect surrender. Volkssturm, unpredictable. The war in April was less a coherent campaign than a series of disconnected tactical encounters where local factors determined outcomes unrelated to strategic situation. April 11th brought an encounter that changed the tone of the campaign and reminded everyone why they were fighting. Elements of the 2nd Armoured Division liberated a concentration camp near Nordhausen. What the tankers found there defied comprehension. Thousands of prisoners in conditions that suggested systematic starvation and abuse, bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors so emaciated they seemed barely human. Sergeant Eddie Price, who'd fought since Normandy and considered himself hardened to war's brutality, wrote in his diary, "We thought we knew what we were fighting against. We didn't know anything. The camps show what Nazi Germany really was, and suddenly every day of combat, every casualty we took, every German we killed, seems justified in ways that military objectives never could justify. This wasn't war. This was fighting evil that wore uniforms and called itself government." The liberation of concentration camps didn't change tactical operations, but it changed how soldiers understood their mission. This wasn't just defeating an enemy army. This was ending a regime that had industrialized murder. April 14th saw American armored spearheads reach the Elbe River, approximately 120 miles from Berlin. The tankers could see evidence of Soviet operations in the east, smoke from burning towns, refugees fleeing west, and occasional reports of artillery fire in the distance. Berlin was within operational reach. The 2nd Armoured Division could have advanced to the German capital in perhaps 3 to 5 days of hard fighting. Instead, on April 15th, orders came from Supreme Headquarters, halt at the Elbe. Berlin was designated a Soviet objective per agreements reached by Allied political leadership. American forces would stop, consolidate positions, and wait for Soviet forces to complete Germany's conquest from the east. The decision was political, not military, and it frustrated tankers who'd fought across Europe and now stopped within sight of what they'd been driving toward for nearly 2 years. May 2nd brought first contact between American and Soviet forces at Torgau on the Elbe River. American tankers met Soviet tank crews in what was supposed to be a moment of Allied unity, but revealed how differently the two armies had fought the war. Soviet 34 tanks were rugged, simple, effective machines built for mass production and brutal frontal assault. American Shermans were mechanically sophisticated, reliable, and designed for sustained operations with minimal maintenance. The crews reflected their machines. Soviet tankers were hardened by warfare of intensity that Western Front veterans couldn't quite comprehend, casualty rates that would have been unacceptable to American commanders, and operational tempo that prioritized results over sustainability. American tankers were professionals, proud of their efficiency, lower casualty rates, and superior logistics. Neither group quite knew what to make of the other. The meeting was cordial, but underscored that Allied unity was political convenience rather than genuine commonality of purpose or method. The final week of the war in Europe was anticlimactic for armoured forces. May 7th brought Germany's unconditional surrender. May 8th was declared VE Day victory in Europe. American tanks that had been in constant motion since the Rhine crossing now sat stationary across occupied Germany, their engines silent, their guns cold, their crews processing the abrupt transition from combat to occupation. The psychological adjustment was disorienting. Months or years of constant danger, where everyday survival required vigilance and skill, suddenly ended. The enemy that had been trying to kill them yesterday was now surrendering en masse. Towns that would have been contested a week ago now offered no resistance. The change was so rapid and total that many veterans described feeling unmoored combat had given them purpose and structure, and peace removed, both without substituting anything equivalent. The final accounting of American armoured operations from D-Day to VE Day showed both the scale of the achievement and its cost. American armoured divisions had advanced from Normandy beaches to central Germany, approximately 800 miles of combat operations through defended terrain against an enemy that, while increasingly resource depleted, never lost tactical competence. American tank losses exceeded 9,000 vehicles. Casualties in armoured divisions totaled approximately 42,000, killed, wounded, and missing, a number that represented enormous human cost, but which, in the context of total forces committed, showed that American Doctrine's emphasis on minimizing casualties through firepower and coordination had been relatively successful. German armoured losses exceeded 15,000 vehicles, and German casualties in battles against American armour were estimated at over 150,000. The exchange rate favoured American forces, both in equipment losses and casualties, validating the strategic approach of accepting technical inferiority in individual tanks while maintaining overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority. The advancing American columns in April encountered German equipment that illustrated how desperate Germany's situation had become. Prototype Panther II tanks with even thicker armour and more powerful guns sat abandoned for lack of fuel. King Tiger heavy tanks, the most powerful tanks fielded in World War II, were destroyed by their own crews because they couldn't retreat and lacked ammunition to fight. German workshops contained partially completed experimental vehicles incorporating features that would have made them formidable had they been produced in quantity. But production in quantity required industrial capacity, resources, and time that Germany no longer possessed. The technical sophistication remained, but it was irrelevant. Germany could design excellent weapons, but couldn't produce them in numbers, fuel them, arm them, or crew them with adequately trained personnel. The industrial and logistical foundations of modern warfare mattered more than engineering excellence. The contrast between early April and early May was stark. On April 1st, American forces were still fighting contested river crossings and advancing against organized resistance. By May 1st, German military formations were disintegrating, soldiers were surrendering in division-sized groups, and the primary operational challenge was managing prisoners rather than defeating defenders. The collapse happened so rapidly that it surprised American commanders who'd planned for continued operations through summer. The Rhine crossing had broken German defensive capability more thoroughly than anyone anticipated. Once Allied forces were across the Rhine with established bridgeheads and adequate supplies, German forces lacked the mobility, fuel, or reserves to establish coherent defense in depth. Each defensive position could be flanked or overwhelmed. Each withdrawal created chaos that prevented organizing the next defensive line. The cascade effect meant that tactical defeats compounded into operational collapse and then strategic disintegration. The question of what American armor achieved in the final month needs careful assessment. Territorially, the advances were enormous. Militarily, the advances destroyed remaining German forces in the west and prevented any possibility of continued resistance. Strategically, the advances positioned American forces in Central Europe with political implications that would shape post-war Europe. But was this achievement the result of American armored excellence or German collapse? The answer is both, and the proportions matter. American armor in April 45 was vastly more capable than American armor in June 44. Better trained, better coordinated, more experienced, operating with institutional knowledge accumulated over nearly 2 years of continuous combat. But German forces in April 45 were also incomparably weaker than German forces in June 44, depleted, undersupplied, disorganized, and demoralized. American improvement and German degradation both contributed to the ease of final operations. The veterans who'd fought since North Africa or Normandy recognized the difference between hard-won victory and collapse-enabled advance. Staff Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, whose crew had fought from Normandy to the Elbe, described the final weeks. Early on, every mile cost something. Every town was a fight. You measured success in surviving the day and gaining a few hundred yards. By April, we were driving through Germany like it was a road march. The fighting happened, but it was sporadic. You'd hit serious resistance in one town, then drive 20 miles to the next town and find nobody defending it. The Germans were done. They just didn't all know it yet, or didn't want to admit it. This assessment, repeated across veteran testimonies, suggested that the final campaign's ease came less from American perfection than from German exhaustion. The victories were real, but they weren't as earned as earlier victories had been. This distinction mattered to men who measured their worth by the difficulty of what they'd overcome. May 8, 1945, marked the end of American armoured warfare in Europe, but it marked beginning of assessment and institutional learning that would shape American military doctrine for decades. The tanks would be mothballed or scrapped, the divisions would be demobilized, but the lessons learned, how to coordinate combined arms, how to integrate air and ground operations, how to sustain mobile forces logistically, how to train crews rapidly and effectively, how to adapt doctrine based on battlefield experience, would be codified in manuals, taught in schools, and applied in future conflicts. The Sherman tank would serve in American forces through the Korean War and in Allied forces for decades beyond. The organizational structures of armored divisions would persist with modifications. The radio procedures, tactical formations, and operational concepts developed through European combat would become foundational to American armored doctrine. Victory in Europe ended the fighting, but began the longer process of understanding what had been learned and ensuring those lessons weren't forgotten. The war was over. The education would continue. August 1945, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, Dr. William Crozier supervised the most comprehensive tank evaluation program in American military history, and what his team was discovering contradicted nearly everything popular opinion believed about American armor. 3 captured German Panthers sat in the testing yard alongside American Shermans, and over 6 weeks of exhaustive comparison testing, the Panthers had performed spectacularly on paper and disastrously in practice. One Panther suffered transmission failure at 68 miles of test driving, another developed engine oil pressure problems at 112 miles, the third stripped its final drive, gears, at 141 miles. The Shermans being tested for comparison had each operated over 500 miles with only routine maintenance. The testing confirmed what field reports had been indicating. German tanks were technically superior in firepower and protection, but operationally inferior in reliability and in sustained combat operations. Reliability mattered more than technical specifications suggested. The operational availability statistics told a story that contradicted the mythology of German tank superiority. Throughout the European campaign, American Sherman tanks maintained an operational availability rate of approximately 85%, meaning that on any given day, 85% of Shermans in a unit were combat ready. Panther tanks averaged 55% operational availability. Tiger tanks managed only 45%. These weren't small differences. They were fundamental disparities that affected everything from tactical planning to strategic capability. An American armored division with 230 Shermans could expect 195 tanks ready for combat each morning. A comparable German Panzer division with 150 tanks could expect 82 Panthers or 68 Tigers ready. The numerical advantage American forces enjoyed in production was multiplied by the reliability advantage that kept American tanks operational while German tanks sat deadline for maintenance. The analysis of actual tank loss causes revealed uncomfortable truths that challenged both American and German assumptions about armoured warfare. Detailed examination of destroyed Shermans from the European campaign showed that only 15% were destroyed in tank versus tank combat. 40% were destroyed by anti-tank guns, the 88s, and smaller caliber weapons that German forces employed more effectively than their tanks. 25% were lost to mines, 20% to mechanical failure, abandonment, or other causes. This distribution meant that the endless debates about Sherman versus Panther in tank duels were largely missing the point. Most Shermans weren't destroyed by enemy tanks. They were destroyed by anti-tank guns that could engage from concealment at long range, or by mines that couldn't be avoided, or by mechanical failures that stranded them in combat zones where they had to be abandoned. The implication was that improving Sherman gun performance or armor protection would have addressed only 15% of tank losses, useful but not transformative. The mobility comparison between Sherman and Panther revealed advantages that weren't apparent from specification sheets. The Sherman's ground pressure, the weight distributed per square inch of track contact, was 13.6 pounds per square inch. The Panther's ground pressure was 15.4 pounds per square inch despite having wider tracks, because the Panther weighed substantially more. In practical terms, this meant Shermans could traverse soft ground where Panthers bogged down. Field commanders reported numerous instances where German armor couldn't maneuver off roads because the ground wouldn't support their weight, while American armor could use cross-country mobility to flank positions or avoid obstacles. The advantage was situational, but significant tactical flexibility often mattered more than armor thickness or gun penetration in determining engagement outcomes. The gun evolution question haunted post-war analysis and generated controversy that persisted for decades. The 76mm gun that gave Sherman's genuine capability against German medium and heavy armor was available in prototype form in 1943. The decision to delay widespread introduction until mid-1944 was based on production considerations. Retooling would slow Sherman production, and on crew feedback that initially rejected the 76mm because it reduced high-explosive shell effectiveness against infantry and fortifications. Tank crews in Italy and early Normandy fighting prioritized anti-infantry capability over anti-tank capability because they encountered enemy infantry more frequently than enemy tanks. By the time crews recognized the need for better anti-tank performance, production had already committed to the 75mm for the majority of Shermans. Whether earlier introduction of the 76mm would have saved lives is debatable, given that only 15% of Sherman losses came from tank combat. Even perfect anti-tank capability wouldn't have prevented the majority of losses. The armor protection mythology requires careful examination because it shaped post-war perception more than wartime reality. Early M4 Shermans with dry ammunition storage did burn catastrophically when penetrated the propellant charges would ignite, creating fires that were often fatal to crews. This created the Ronson Lighter nickname and persistent belief that Shermans were death traps. But by early 1944, Sherman production shifted to wet ammunition storage surrounding the propellant charges with water jackets that prevented ignition even when struck. Shermans with wet storage that were penetrated by armor-piercing fire had crew survival rates exceeding 85%. This was higher than Panther crew survival rates of approximately 70% and far higher than early war tank survival rates. The wet storage modification was simple, cheap, and dramatically effective, yet popular perception fixated on the burning Shermans from early production rather than the protected crews from later production. The cost per mile analysis revealed why American armor doctrine emphasized reliability over performance. A Sherman's operational cost, fuel, maintenance, parts, and crew averaged approximately $12 per mile traveled in 1944 dollars. A Panther's operational cost averaged $34 per mile. Over a 1,000-mile campaign, a Sherman cost $12,000 to operate. A Panther cost $34,000. Multiply this by hundreds or thousands of vehicles, and the cost differential became strategically significant. Germany simply couldn't afford to operate its sophisticated tanks at the tempo American forces sustained. The economic efficiency of the Sherman, combined with American logistical capacity to deliver parts and fuel, meant American armor could sustain operations that German armor couldn't match, regardless of individual tank quality. The crew preference surveys conducted in late 1944 and early 45 produced surprising results that contradicted popular narratives. When veteran Sherman crews, men who'd fought in Shermans for months and encountered German tanks in combat, were asked whether they'd prefer to switch to captured German tanks, 68% said no. They preferred their Shermans. The reasons cited weren't patriotism or ignorance of German technical superiority. Crews appreciated the Sherman's reliability, its spacious interior that made crew operation comfortable, its ease of maintenance, and most importantly, their familiarity with the vehicle. They knew the Sherman's capabilities and limitations intimately. They had developed crew coordination based on the Sherman's specific characteristics. Switching to a different tank, even a technically superior one, would require relearning crew coordination and would sacrifice the reliability they'd come to depend on. The survey suggested that crew effectiveness depended more on familiarity and reliability than on technical specifications. The strategic mobility question, the ability to transport tanks to theatres of war, heavily favoured American armour in ways that mattered more than tactical mobility. A Sherman could be shipped across the Atlantic and unloaded at any port with standard dock facilities. Panthers and Tigers required specialized heavy lift equipment and reinforced docks because of their weight. More importantly, Shermans could be transported by standard rail cars on American and European rail networks. German heavy tanks required specialized rail cars and couldn't use many railway routes because bridges wouldn't support their weight. This meant American armor could be moved globally while German armor was constrained to regions with infrastructure capable of handling their weight. In a global war where theaters included North Africa, Italy, and France, the ability to ship tanks anywhere mattered enormously. The final synthesis of quantitative analysis suggested that the Sherman's reputation as inferior was historically inaccurate when evaluated by appropriate metrics. Yes, the Sherman was inferior to the Panther in frontal armor protection and gun penetration. Yes, in a frontal tank duel at medium range, the Panther won, but evaluating tanks based on single combat scenarios missed everything that actually mattered in sustained campaign operations. The Sherman was superior in reliability, operational availability, maintainability, strategic mobility, crew survivability, and cost effectiveness. It was adequate in firepower and armor for the vast majority of engagements it faced. It was produced in quantities that allowed American forces to replace losses faster than they occurred. And it was supported by a logistics system that kept it fueled, armed, and operational throughout continuous combat operations. The Panther was a masterpiece of engineering designed for a type of warfare Germany could no longer conduct. The Sherman was an adequate machine designed for the war America was actually fighting. Adequate plus sustainable beat excellent plus unsustainable. The post-war assessment concluded that the Sherman controversy represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what made weapons systems effective in industrial warfare. Individual weapon quality mattered less than system integration, logistical sustainability, and the ability to produce weapons in quantities that allowed operational freedom. Germany produced tanks that won individual engagements, but couldn't win campaigns because there were never enough of them. They couldn't be sustained logistically, and losses couldn't be replaced. America produced tanks that sometimes lost individual engagements but won campaigns because they were numerous, sustainable, and replaceable. The lesson extended beyond tanks to military procurement generally. The best weapon was the weapon you could field in adequate numbers, sustain operationally, and replace when lost. Excellence that couldn't be sustained was just expensive failure. Adequacy that could be sustained was actual capability. The Sherman embodied this philosophy, and America's victory in the European theatre validated it. Fort Knox, Kentucky, November 1946. Colonel Michael Healy presided over the Armored Force Doctrine Revision Conference, and the men assembled in the briefing room represented a cross-section of American armored warfare experience that would have been unimaginable 4 years earlier. Major Robert Callahan, who'd commanded tanks from Normandy to the Elbe, Lieutenant Colonel James Leach, who'd fought at Aracourt and the Bulge, Sergeant Major Williams, who'd survived Kasserine and trained thousands of crews at Fort Knox. Officers from every major campaign sat together reviewing after-action reports, tactical analyses, and combat statistics to codify what American armor had learned through 2.5 years of continuous warfare. The goal wasn't to write history, but to capture lessons in doctrinal form that would guide American armored forces for the next war whenever and wherever that war came. What emerged from weeks of analysis was remarkable. American armored doctrine hadn't just evolved from failure to success, it had evolved in ways that were fundamentally different from German doctrine. It had initially tried to emulate. The comparison between Field Manual 1710 from 1942 and the revised 1944 version revealed doctrinal transformation in specific, measurable terms. The 1942 manual emphasized tank versus tank combat, prescribed massed armor attacks as the primary operational method, and treated combined arms cooperation as supplementary to armored action. The 1944 manual reversed these priorities. Tank versus tank combat was described as situational and often avoidable. Combined arms teams, armor, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support operating as integrated units were prescribed as the standard operational method. The role of armor was redefined from breakthrough force to exploitation force, with breakthrough achieved through combined arms efforts and armor exploiting the gaps created. This wasn't subtle modification, it was fundamental reconceptualization of what armor was for and how it should be employed. The combined arms statistics from late war operations validated the doctrinal shift. Analysis of successful American armored operations in 1945 showed that approximately 60% of tanks operated in direct cooperation with infantry support at the squad and platoon level. Artillery support could be called and delivered within 8 minutes on average, down from 45 minutes in 1944. Air support requests were processed and delivered within 20 minutes on average when weather permitted. This coordination wasn't accidental or dependent on exceptional commanders. It was systematized through radio networks, standardized procedures, liaison officers, and training that emphasized integration rather than parallel operations. German doctrine, by contrast, remained focused on independent armored operations conducted by panzer divisions with infantry and artillery supporting tank actions rather than tanks supporting combined arms actions. The artillery integration question showed American institutional flexibility in ways that contrasted sharply with German rigidity. In 1942, American armor and artillery communicated poorly, operated on different radio frequencies, and required complex coordination through multiple command levels to achieve fire support. By 1945, forward observers from artillery battalions were embedded with armored units at company level. Artillery fire direction centers monitored armor radio networks continuously, and pre-planned fire missions were registered along anticipated routes of advance. An armored company commander in contact with enemy forces could request artillery support by radio and receive fire within minutes without involving battalion or division headquarters. The Germans maintained centralized artillery control throughout the war, which allowed sophisticated fire planning but prevented responsive support to tactical situations. American decentralization traded perfect coordination for speed of response, and in fluid combat situations, speed mattered more than perfection. The air-ground coordination evolution was even more dramatic. In 1943, requesting air support required written requests submitted through channels that could take hours or days to process, and the likelihood that requested air support would arrive when and where needed was minimal. By 1945, the 19th Tactical Air Command had forward air controllers operating with ground units, pilots briefed on ground force positions and objectives before every mission, and radio procedures that allowed near real-time coordination. P-47 Thunderbolt pilots described missions where they received target updates from ground forces while approaching the target area and adjusted their attack runs based on information provided by tankers and infantry who could see enemy positions the pilots couldn't yet identify. This level of integration required technology, radios, aircraft, training, but it also required institutional culture that empowered junior leaders to coordinate across service branches without seeking higher approval. The flexibility doctrine that emerged from American experience contradicted traditional military emphasis on following established procedures. German military culture valued Auftragstactik mission-type orders where senior commanders specified objectives and subordinates determined methods, but German doctrine was otherwise quite prescriptive about how operations should be conducted. American doctrine evolved toward mission command that was genuinely flexible. Field manual revisions in 1944 included language explicitly stating that doctrine was guidance, not requirement, and that situations not covered by doctrine required commanders to exercise judgment based on principles rather than procedures. This sounds obvious, but it represented significant departure from military tradition where deviation from doctrine required justification. American doctrine by late war encouraged deviation when situations warranted it. The analysis of after-action reports from 1944 and 45 showed that American junior officers increasingly exercised independent initiative in ways that earlier war years hadn't seen. Tank platoon leaders would modify attack plans in execution based on terrain or enemy dispositions without requesting permission. Company commanders would shift boundaries and coordinate directly with adjacent units without involving battalion headquarters. This wasn't insubordination, but empowerment, the institutional recognition that the officer on the ground had better information than commanders in rear areas and should be trusted to act on that information. The statistics bore this out. Successful American armored operations in 1945 showed significantly more battlefield initiative at platoon and company levels than operations in 1943, and this initiative correlated with reduced casualties and improved mission success rates. The command philosophy comparison between Patton and German panzer commanders revealed convergent evolution towards similar principles from different starting points. Patton's operational method emphasized speed, aggression, and initiative, while maintaining overall strategic coordination. German panzer doctrine emphasized similar principles, but Patton empowered subordinates to make decisions without referencing higher command, while German commanders often micromanaged tactical details despite espousing mission command principles. Post-war interviews with German officers captured in late war revealed frustration that rigid command structures prevented adapting to American operational tempo. One Panzer Division commander testified, "We knew what needed to be done, but executing required approvals that took time we didn't have." American commanders seemed able to make decisions and act immediately. By the time we'd coordinated our response, the situation had changed. The training validation came from statistical analysis of crew survival and effectiveness based on training origins. Crews that completed the full Fort Knox 13-week program had casualty rates approximately 30% lower than replacement crews trained in abbreviated programs or assigned without formal training. They also achieved mission success rates that were measurably higher, though defining mission success in armor operations was complex and somewhat subjective. The correlation between training quality and combat performance was strong enough that post-war doctrine recommended maintaining rigorous training standards even when facing crew shortages, rather than diluting standards to increase throughput. This was controversial. It meant accepting short-term shortages for long-term effectiveness, but the data supported it. The logistics doctrine that emerged from European operations fundamentally redefined how American forces conceptualized armored warfare. The pre-war vision of armor as a decisive striking arm that would win battles through maneuver and firepower gave way to understanding armor as component of a logistics-intensive system where fuel, ammunition, parts, and maintenance determined operational capability as much as tactical skill. The revised doctrine included extensive sections on logistics planning, fuel consumption calculations, and maintenance schedules that would have seemed bureaucratic to pre-war planners but which reflected combat reality. German armor doctrine never fully integrated logistics planning at the tactical level. Panzer divisions assumed logistics would be provided and focused doctrine on combat operations. American armor doctrine made logistics a command responsibility at every level. Tank platoon leaders were expected to know their fuel state, plan movements to minimize consumption, and coordinate with supply elements. This was unglamorous but essential. The defensive doctrine development showed American institutional learning from German methods. Early American armor doctrine emphasized offensive operations and provided minimal guidance for defensive employment of armor. The Bulge battle forced rapid learning about how to use armor defensively, and the lessons were codified quickly. The revised doctrine included detailed procedures for mobile defense, counterattack operations, and economy of force missions, all situations where armor defended rather than attacked. The doctrine acknowledged that armor's mobility made it valuable for defensive operations, allowing commanders to concentrate forces rapidly at threatened points or shift between sectors based on enemy actions. This wasn't revolutionary. German forces had employed mobile defense throughout the war, but it was new to American doctrine and represented willingness to learn from enemy methods. The synthesis of all these doctrinal elements created something distinctive. American armored doctrine by war's end wasn't German doctrine with American equipment, nor was it unique American invention. It was hybrid doctrine that took German concepts of mobile warfare, British experience with combined arms coordination, American emphasis on logistics and industrial support, and lessons learned through painful combat experience, then integrated them into coherent operational method that played to American strengths. The doctrine assumed air superiority, abundant logistics, numerical advantage, and the ability to replace losses assumptions that reflected American strategic situation but wouldn't apply to all nations or all wars. This limitation was recognized. The doctrine was explicitly American doctrine for American forces fighting with American resources. It wasn't universal theory of armored warfare, but specific application of armored warfare under conditions American forces could create and sustain. The Fort Knox Conference concluded with doctrine that would guide American armored forces through the Korean War, influence NATO doctrine during the Cold War, and establish principles that remain relevant into the 21st century. The specific tanks would change, the technological details would evolve, but the fundamental concepts, combined arms integration, flexible execution of mission-type orders, logistics as operational enabler, Continuous institutional learning from combat experience would persist. The doctrine worked not because it prescribed perfect solutions, but because it created framework for adaptation, learning, and improvement. It assumed that future wars would require different approaches than past wars, and built in mechanisms for evolution. This doctrine about how to develop doctrine was perhaps the most important legacy of American armored warfare in World War II. The lesson wasn't what worked in 1945, but how to figure out what would work in whatever came next. November 1944, Field Hospital, 20 miles behind the front lines, Belgium. Dr. Sarah Morrison worked on her 5th burn case of the day and tried to maintain the clinical detachment that made the work bearable. The patient was a tank loader, 20 years old, with severe burns across 40% of his body from white phosphorus that had penetrated his Sherman's hatches during an artillery barrage. The burns were 3rd degree in places, down to bone, and the screaming had only stopped when morphine took effect. Morrison had been a surgeon in civilian practice before the war, had considered herself prepared for trauma medicine, and had discovered in 6 months of combat hospital work that nothing prepared you for what modern war did to human bodies. The tank crews were worst. When artillery or mines wounded infantry, the injuries were terrible but at least comprehensible. When tank ammunition detonated or white phosphorus ignited inside a sealed metal compartment, what happened to the crew members was beyond what human bodies were designed to survive. Some lived, many didn't. Those who lived often carried injuries that would affect them the rest of their lives, if they got to have rest of their lives. The statistical accounting of American armored forces casualties from June 1944 through May 1945 showed numbers that were simultaneously lower than earlier wars and higher than anyone wanted to acknowledge. American armored divisions in the European theatre suffered approximately 42,000 casualties killed, wounded, and missing. This represented roughly 30% of total personnel strength committed to armored divisions over the campaign, a casualty rate that was high but substantially lower than infantry divisions, which experienced casualty rates exceeding 60% in some cases. The difference reflected both armor's mobility, which allowed avoiding some types of combat, and armor's protection, which prevented some wounds that would have been fatal to unprotected infantry. But the numbers obscured individual experiences that statistics couldn't capture. The crew survival statistics revealed patterns about how men died in armored combat. When a Sherman was penetrated by armor-piercing fire, approximately 15% of casualties were immediately fatal, crew members killed instantly by the penetrating round or the resulting internal spalling. 35% were wounded with varying degrees of severity, from minor shrapnel wounds to catastrophic injuries. 50% were uninjured and able to bail out and continue fighting. These percentages applied to Shermans with wet ammunition storage, manufactured after early 1944. Earlier Shermans with dry storage had fatal casualty rates approaching 40% because ammunition fires killed crew members who survived the initial penetration. The improvement from wet storage represented thousands of lives saved by a simple engineering modification, but it came too late for crews who died in earlier production vehicles. The burn problem deserves specific examination because it represented the most feared injury among tankers. 15% of tank casualties involved severe burns, usually from white phosphorus or fuel fires. White phosphorus burned at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit and would burn through anything. It contacted steel, flesh, bone, continuing to burn until the chemical was completely consumed or deprived of oxygen. Tankers hit with white phosphorus had two options: immerse the affected area in water immediately, or accept that the chemical would burn through tissue until it exhausted itself. Field hospitals kept water tanks specifically for white phosphorus burn victims, but getting from a burning tank to medical care required time that many wounded didn't have. The psychological impact of knowing that injury might mean burning alive affected crew morale in ways that are difficult to quantify, but which appeared repeatedly in letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies. The age demographics of American tank crews reflected the youth of men sent to fight industrialized war. The average American tanker was 22 years old. 40% of all tankers were between 19 and 21. This meant that most crew members had been in high school when Pearl Harbor occurred and had gone directly from civilian adolescence to military training to combat operations within 2 or 3 years. The psychological development from teenager to combat veteran happened in compressed time frame that would affect these men for the rest of their lives. The youngest tanker killed in action was 17. He'd lied about his age to enlist. The oldest was 43, a National Guard sergeant who'd been called up with his unit. Most were somewhere in between, young enough that war was the formative experience of their adult lives. The personal stories illuminate what statistics obscure. Private James Chen, driver for a Sherman in the 4th Armoured Division, survived the Bulge battle but lost both legs below the knee to frostbite after his tank was disabled in December fighting, and he spent 18 hours in freezing temperatures before rescue. Chen was 20 years old. He'd expected to return home after the war and take over his family's restaurant in San Francisco. Instead, he spent 2 years in veterans' hospitals learning to walk with prosthetics and adapting to physical limitations he'd carry for life. His story was repeated thousands of times with variations. Men who survived combat but whose lives were permanently altered by injuries, psychological trauma, or simply the experience of violence on scales that peacetime life provided no framework for understanding. Sergeant Robert Martinez, gunner from New Mexico, achieved 19 confirmed tank kills during the European campaign, an exceptional record that made him statistically one of the most effective tank gunners in the American Army. He received medals, commendations, and recognition. He also developed what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which in 1945 was called combat fatigue, if it was called anything at all. Martinez's post-war VA records show treatment for anxiety, depression, nightmares, and difficulty maintaining employment due to psychological symptoms that made civilian life nearly impossible. The recognition for his combat achievement came with psychological costs that the medals didn't mention and the Army initially didn't treat. Martinez was far from unique. Post-war VA records show that approximately 22% of armoured veterans sought mental health support in the decade after the war, a number that likely understates the actual prevalence of psychological impact because many veterans never sought treatment due to stigma or lack of awareness. Lieutenant William Duncan, who'd commanded a Sherman platoon from Normandy through Germany, returned home physically uninjured and psychologically scarred in ways he couldn't articulate. His letters to family showed progressive deterioration of optimism and increasing cynicism about war, military service, and human nature. A letter from June 1944 described combat as exciting and terrifying but meaningful. We're defeating evil and liberating Europe. A letter from March 1945 described combat as mechanized slaughter, where the only meaning is survival and everything else is lies we tell ourselves to justify continuing. Duncan survived, returned home, completed college on the GI Bill, and lived a conventionally successful life. But his private writings, discovered after his death in 1989, revealed that he never fully recovered from what he'd experienced, that the war remained the central event of his life decades later, and that his understanding of himself and the world had been fundamentally shaped by months of violence and fear. The medical reality of treating armoured warfare casualties involved injuries that civilian medicine rarely encountered. Burns from white phosphorus required treatments that were experimental in 1944 and which left scarring that plastic surgery could minimise but not eliminate. Traumatic amputations from armour-piercing rounds that struck crew members directly were catastrophic injuries that often resulted in death from shock and blood loss even when the wounds themselves were theoretically survivable. Blast injuries from ammunition detonations inside tanks created internal trauma, ruptured organs, brain injuries, hearing loss that weren't always immediately apparent but which caused long-term health problems. The field hospitals treating these casualties developed expertise in trauma medicine that would influence civilian emergency medicine for decades after the war, but the learning came at the cost of the patients who were the subjects of this terrible education. The letters home that tankers wrote revealed how they understood and communicated their experiences to families who couldn't possibly comprehend what they were describing. Most letters were deliberately vague about combat specifics, partly because of censorship, but mostly because tankers recognized that honest description would horrify their families without providing understanding. Phrases like, "We saw some action today," or "It was rough, but we came through okay," stood in for experiences that included watching friends burn to death, killing enemy soldiers at ranges close enough to see their faces, and living with constant awareness that the next hour might be your last. The gap between what tankers experienced and what they could communicate created psychological isolation that many veterans described as one of the hardest aspects of military service. The knowledge that the most intense experiences of their lives couldn't be shared with the people they loved. The reunion testimonies from post-war gatherings of Armoured Division veterans showed how these men processed their experiences over time. Initial reunions in the late 1940s focused on remembering fallen comrades and celebrating survival. Reunions in the 1960s and 70s began acknowledging the psychological costs and the difficulty of reintegration into civilian life. Later reunions included discussions of what the war meant, whether it was worth the cost, and how to understand experiences that seemed increasingly distant from contemporary life. One veteran described the evolution. At first, we couldn't talk about it except with each other. Then we couldn't stop talking about it. Then we realized that even talking about it didn't help us understand it. Finally, we accepted that we'd never fully understand it, and that was okay. The war happened, we survived, that's what we know. The specific price paid for American armored warfare's evolution from amateur to professional was measurable in individual lives destroyed or diminished. Every tactical lesson learned represented engagements where men died or were wounded because doctrine was inadequate, training was insufficient, or equipment failed. The improvement from Kasserine to the Rhine was real, but it was purchased with casualties that could have been avoided if the institutional learning had happened before combat rather than during combat. This wasn't unique to American forces. Every military in history has learned through costly experience, but it doesn't make the cost less real or the losses less tragic. The 42,000 armored forces casualties included men who died because their commanders didn't yet understand how to employ armor effectively, because their equipment had flaws that weren't yet corrected, because their training didn't prepare them for situations they encountered. The casualties decreased as the war progressed and learning occurred, but the early casualties paid the price for later improvements. The question of whether the human cost was justified requires engaging with moral questions that have no purely military answers. Did defeating Nazi Germany justify 42,000 American armored forces casualties plus millions of other casualties across all forces and nations? Most veterans would say yes, particularly after seeing the concentration camps and understanding what they'd been fighting against. But individual tragedies don't aggregate into collective justification easily. Each death, each injury, each psychological trauma was experienced individually, affected individual families, and left individual voids that victory didn't fill. The war was necessary, the cause was just, the victory mattered, and men still died in ways that were brutal, painful, and individually tragic, regardless of strategic necessity. Both truths coexist uncomfortably, and any honest accounting of American armored warfare must acknowledge both the achievement and the cost, not as abstractions but as lived human experience by specific individuals whose names and stories deserve to be remembered, along with the tactics, statistics, and strategic outcomes. June 1950, Busan Perimeter, South Korea. Captain Robert Callahan, now commanding a company of M4 Sherman tanks in the 1st Cavalry Division, experienced the strangest sense of déjà vu as his tanks engaged North Korean 34 Soviet-built tanks near the Naktung River. The Shermans, the same basic design that had fought across Europe 5 years earlier, were back in combat, and the lessons learned in France and Germany were being applied in completely different terrain against a completely different enemy. The 34 was technically superior to the Sherman in several respects, just as the Panther had been, but Korean terrain favoured maneuver and coordination over technical specifications, just as European combat had. Callahan's crews executed the same flanking tactics, the same combined arms coordination with infantry and artillery, the same operational principles that had been codified at Fort Knox in 1946. The doctrine developed in World War II was proving applicable to a new war in a new decade, and the institutional knowledge carried by veterans like Callahan was bridging the gap between conflicts and proving more durable than the tanks themselves. The institutional continuity from World War II to the Korean War was remarkable in military terms. Approximately 70% of American armor officers in 1950 were World War II veterans. They'd fought in Europe or the Pacific, learned armored warfare through combat experience, and now commanded units employing doctrine they'd helped develop. This direct knowledge transfer prevented the institutional amnesia that often afflicts militaries between wars. The tactics that worked in 1945 were taught to crews in 1950 not as abstract theory, but as practical wisdom from officers who'd proven the tactics in combat. The Korean War became validation exercise for World War II doctrine, testing whether principles developed against German forces in European terrain applied against communist forces in Asian terrain. The tank evolution from World War II through the Cold War showed physical lineage that connected Sherman to Patton to M60. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, which entered service in late World War II, too late to see extensive combat, incorporated lessons about armor and firepower from Sherman combat experience. The M46 Patton tank, which succeeded the Pershing in 1948, improved reliability and mobility while maintaining the heavier armor and more powerful gun that Sherman crews had identified as desirable. The M47 and M48 Patton variants, which became America's main battle tanks in the 1950s, represented incremental evolution rather than revolutionary redesign. Each generation incorporated specific lessons from the previous generation's combat use. The lineage was clear. World War II combat experience identified requirements, post-war design incorporated those requirements, and subsequent combat validated or refuted the design choices in cycles that continued through the Cold War. The Doctrine export through NATO standardization spread American armored warfare principles across Allied forces in ways that shaped Cold War military planning. When NATO was established in 1949, American doctrine became the foundation for alliance-wide armor tactics, because American forces had the most recent large-scale combat experience, and because American industrial capacity made equipment and methods the practical standard. British, French, and later West German armored forces adopted American-derived doctrine with modifications for their specific circumstances. The NATO standardization agreements covered everything from radio frequencies to tactical formations to logistics procedures, and most were based on American World War II experience codified into alliance policy. The global spread of American armored doctrine meant that lessons learned in Normandy and the Ardennes influenced how armies from Norway to Turkey organized and employed armor. The Korean War's tank combat provided surprising validation of Sherman adequacy and World War II tactical principles. North Korean 34s had thicker armor and more powerful guns than Shermans. Similar to the Panther-Sherman relationship in Europe, American crews responded with the same tactical adaptations: avoid frontal engagements, use numerical superiority to achieve flanking positions, coordinate with infantry and artillery rather than fighting purely tank versus tank engagements. The results were comparable to Europe. American forces achieved favorable exchange ratios, not through technical superiority, but through superior coordination, better logistics, and doctrine that emphasized system integration over individual vehicle quality. The 34 was arguably the best medium tank of World War II and remained formidable in Korea, but American combined arms employment defeated it consistently. The 1973 Yom Kippur War provided another data point for evaluating World War II doctrine's enduring relevance. Israeli armored forces, equipped with American tanks and trained in doctrine derived from American methods, fought Arab forces equipped with Soviet tanks and Soviet doctrine. The parallels to World War II were inexact but illuminating. Israeli emphasis on crew training, combined arms coordination, and aggressive maneuver reflected American doctrinal heritage. Arab forces' greater emphasis on technical capabilities and set-piece operations reflected different doctrinal traditions. The war's outcome, Israeli tactical victories, despite being outnumbered and occasionally outgunned, suggested that World War II American principles about training, coordination, and institutional flexibility retained value decades after their development. The training legacy from Fort Knox to modern armor schools showed remarkable continuity in instructional philosophy, despite changes in equipment and tactics. The 13-week training cycle, established in 1943, remained the basic template for American armor training through the 1980s. The emphasis on crew cohesion training tank crews as intact units rather than training individuals and later assigning them to crews persisted because World War II experience had proven its value. The use of realistic force-on-force exercises rather than static drills, the emphasis on first-round accuracy over volume of fire, the integration of combined arms coordination into basic training rather than treating it as advanced skill, all these principles established at Fort Knox during World War II remained foundational to American armor training for generations. The production philosophy debate whether to produce adequate numbers of good enough equipment or smaller numbers of excellent equipment remained contentious throughout the Cold War and echoed World War II arguments. The M60 tank program in the 1960s faced criticism for being technically inferior to new Soviet tanks, exactly paralleling Sherman criticism relative to Panthers. The counterargument was exactly the same. The M60 could be produced in quantity, maintained in field conditions, transported globally, and operated by crews with reasonable training. Smaller numbers of technically superior tanks might win individual engagements but couldn't provide the sustained capability that Cold War global commitments required. The debate was never fully resolved because both sides had valid points, but American procurement consistently favored the Sherman philosophy, adequate quality in sustainable quantities, over the German philosophy of technical excellence in limited numbers. Fort Knox in 1955 looked remarkably similar to Fort Knox in 1945. The same ranges, the same training areas, many of the same instructors wearing new rank but carrying the same knowledge. Captain Michael Healy, who'd overseen Doctrine revision in 1946, was now a colonel commanding the armor school and ensuring that World War II lessons remained central to curriculum. The M47 Patton tanks replacing Shermans were different vehicles, but the tactical principles being taught were direct descendants of principles developed in European combat. Students learn about the importance of combined arms by studying Aracourt. They learned about terrain's determinative effects by studying the Hürtgen forest. They learned about mobile defense by studying the Bulge. World War II wasn't distant history. It was the foundational case study for everything American armor doctrine claimed to be true. The conceptual legacy ideas that outlasted specific equipment or organizations might be World War II American armor's most important contribution to military theory. The idea that logistics determined operational capability as much as tactical skill influenced American military planning throughout the Cold War and into contemporary operations. The idea that continuous institutional learning from combat experience should be systematized rather than left to chance influenced how the U.S. military developed doctrine in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts. The idea that crew quality and coordination mattered more than individual weapon technical specifications influenced training priorities across military branches. These weren't originally American ideas. Militaries had recognized these principles for centuries, but American World War II experience provided modern case studies that validated the principles and demonstrated how to apply them at industrial scale. The veterans who'd fought in World War II carried their experiences into civilian life and influenced American culture in ways that extended beyond military doctrine. Business leaders who'd learned logistics coordination as quartermaster officers applied those skills to corporate supply chains. Engineers who'd modified equipment in field conditions brought that practical innovation mindset to civilian industry. Leaders who'd learned to coordinate diverse teams under stress applied those leadership skills to peacetime organizations. The diffusion of military experience into civilian society meant that World War II's lessons influenced post-war American development in ways that weren't directly military, but which reflected institutional knowledge developed through military service. This was soft legacy, harder to measure than doctrinal continuity, but arguably more pervasive. The question of what endures from any war is always complex. Technology becomes obsolete. Specific tactics are superseded by new methods. Even institutions evolve beyond recognition. But principles, if they're valid, persist across technological and organizational changes. American armored warfare in World War II generated principles about the relationship between technical quality and operational sustainability, about the importance of institutional learning and adaptation, about combined arms integration and logistics as operational enablers. These principles weren't unique to armor or even to ground forces, but armor provided the case study that made them concrete and demonstrable. The Sherman tank is in museums now, but the understanding that adequate equipment produced in sustainable quantities beats excellent equipment produced in limited quantities remains relevant to military procurement debates in the 21st century. The final assessment requires acknowledging both achievement and limitation. American armored forces didn't win World War II alone. They were one component of a massive coalition effort across multiple theaters and multiple years. They weren't the war's most effective armored force by many metrics. Soviet armored forces destroyed more German tanks and advanced further into German territory. They didn't field the best tanks or develop the most sophisticated doctrine. What American armored forces did do was transform from amateur to professional in compressed time frame. Develop doctrine that played to American strengths rather than imitating German methods, and contribute meaningfully to Allied victory in Western Europe. The legacy isn't perfection, but competence, the development of institutional capability to conduct armored warfare effectively, sustainably, and in ways that could be taught, learned, and improved upon by subsequent generations. The tankers who fought from Kasserine to the Rhine didn't know they were creating legacy. They were trying to survive, trying to accomplish missions, trying to help the men beside them get through combat. The doctrine, the lessons, the institutional knowledge all emerged from accumulated experience of thousands of individuals doing their jobs under terrible conditions and learning from success and failure. If those original tankers could see what their experience produced, the doctrine that guided American armor through Korea and the Cold War, the training methods that persisted for generations, the principles that remained relevant decades after their tanks were scrapped, they'd likely be surprised that their improvised solutions to immediate problems became formalized wisdom. But that's how institutional knowledge develops, through the unglamorous accumulation of practical lessons learned by people who were focused on immediate survival rather than historical legacy. The Sherman wasn't the best tank, American doctrine wasn't perfect, but both were good enough, sustainable, and continuously improvable. And in the end, good enough plus sustainable beat excellent plus brittle. That lesson outlasted everything else.